Mr. Wang, please turn on your speaker.
Your Excellencies, Mr. Ruffran, Ambassador Shaw, Mrs. Ramos, Ambassador Rossini, Ambassador Yi, honored speakers and distinguished panelists, viewers, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and good afternoon. On behalf of the think tank organizers, I warmly welcome all of you to this very important event that we're holding today. The day after tomorrow, on June 26th, the UN General Assembly will hold a commemoration of the signing of the Charter of the UN for this event. Echoed to this special occasion, Academy of Contemporary China and World Studies, Center for China and Globalization, Center for International Security and Strategy, Dialogue of Civilization Research Institute, Varda Discussion Club, British East Asian Council are co-hosting this online forum in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter. So on June 26, 1945, 75 years ago, the Charter was signed in San Francisco at the conclusion of the United Nations Conference on International Organization and coming into force on 24th of October, 1945. And China was actually the first country to sign the Charter. By the means of saving succeeding generations from scourge of war, the Charter calls for UN to maintain international peace and security, promoting social progress and better understanding of life, strengthening international law, and promoting human rights. 75 years ago, the founding of the United Nations raised hopes for a new era of peace and prosperity for all countries. For the past 75 years, the United Nations has become a cornerstone of today's multilateral architectures, tasks with the managing and reduce shared global problem. The year 2020 saw the global outbreak of COVID-19, which has infected over 9.3 million people and killed nearly 500,000 worldwide. Facing unprecedented global health crisis with severe human, economic, and social costs, it serves our shared interest to uphold multilateralism and safeguard the international system with the UN at its core. Today, it is a good opportunity and an urgent moment for us to review the success and the lessons learned in implementing UN Charter over the last 75 years and look ahead to how best to collectively overcome current upcoming challenges, helping UN enhance multilateralism to collectively achieve the sustainable development goals. So will this pandemic crisis provide a golden opportunity to rekindle the commitment to the multilateralism and sustainable development? How can the United Nations regenerate its capacity for mobilizing cooperation for shared challenges and reshape the zeitgeist of our time? So we are very honored to have such a great distinguished speakers with us today, and so that we will introduce them in our when their speaking time is coming. So 2020 must be a year of a dialogue. So when we come together to discuss our priorities as a human family and how we can build a better future for all, it is really imperative for all to adhere to the purpose and the principles of UN Charter, strengthen the international legal order, and maintain international cooperation. So we are very pleased and very fortunate to have all of you gathered at this special occasion on the eve of UN signing the UN Charter. So I'm just making this brief introduction, and on behalf of the Chinese organizers. And also, I would also invite Dr. Yakunin to speak a few words on behalf of the international think tank organizer. Dr. Yakunin, please. Please open your speaker.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished Dr. Wang. I'm very pleased to see you and many familiar faces at this very important gathering, though, you know, of course, webinar gathering, not physical, but I still hope, I'm optimist that we will have the chance to sit together to drink some tea in China capital or whatever places. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I only can support what was said by Dr. Wang concerning the very important date we are going to commemorate. And it is very important to learn from the previous history in order to prevent the crisis in contemporary world. The current crisis has triggered a profound discussion around how the world's major multilateral organizations are governed and what steps can be taken to redress current imbalances which we observe. Yes, we are celebrating 75 years anniversary of the creation of the United Nations. As a result of the Second World War, there was a tragic event. For the Soviet Union and China, it was very heavy losses. You know, it was around 27, more or less official figure is 26.6 million lives were given up to protect the world from fascism on the Soviet side. More than 20 lives were lost by China, and if, calculated with all possible losses and damages, it will be even higher. And around 80 million lives were lost totally in the world. The main basis for the United Nations was the consensus among the victorious parties regarding the outcomes of the war and aimed to avoiding future global conflicts and fostering sustainable socioeconomic development of mankind. 75 years ago, the leaders of absolutely different countries with different politics, different ideologies, were able to put aside their differences to create a successful mechanism for global cooperation. To do this, they were courageous, and they were actual leaders of the world. In my opinion, this remains a critical element in effective international relations as opposed to highly ideologized approach that we can observe today. Unfortunately, events in recent years have been criticized by a lack of trust among the leading countries and leaders, and inability to cooperate properly against new threats. This suggests that the 75-year post-World War II era possibly is coming to an end, but not the history of mankind, of course. And that we must rethink and suggest new world order and look for new models of global cooperation and development. It is obvious for us in DOC Research Institute that the new consensus should not simply demolish the previous system and institutions, but rather seek to reimagine new and how they should develop in the future due to consideration of the new global realities and the digitalization of the world. This raises the question, which we are also will go to address, the question about new leadership. Not an attempted leadership based on nationalism or the feeling of superiority, but better on the basis of solidarity and trust. Adopting a zero-sum perspective is to our mind, is oversimplified attitude for understanding of international relations. A multilateral world should be based on equal cooperation of equal civilizations, as we say, not be equal from the point of view of economic power or military might, but from the point of view that any civilization is valuable piece of the civilizational mosaic of our global world. The practice of dialogue of civilization is in fact a way of building a global community. It combines the positive human potential of civilizational identities, state structures, social and economic features, as well as cultural and historical diversity. Only working together, we can protect the future of mankind from challenges, existent challenges, and yet to come. And I hope this webinar, this forum, organized together with our best Chinese friends, will prove that we are able to create this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yakunin, for speaking on behalf of International Think Tanks co-organizers. So this is really a great beginning. So let's get into the main theme and also keynote speaker today. We actually divided today's section into three parts. First, we have a keynote speakers for the opening keynote, and then we have two panels, and one on multilateralism, and then one on sustainable development. So this is the agenda. We'll have a very full agenda and have very distinguished panelists join us. So first of all, I would like to introduce the first opening keynote speaker. His Excellency Ambassador Sajid Khan. He's the former Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations. So Mr. Shah, Ambassador Shah is Under-Secretary for the Economic and the Social Affairs of UN. And Ambassador Shah served as a permanent representative of China to the United Nations office in Geneva. He was also Director General of the Department of Armed Control, Minister of Foreign Affairs. And in recent years, he served respectively as the chairperson of the government group of the governing body of the International Labour Organization. And over his 37 years of diplomatic career, his portfolio covers a wide range of fields, including security, economy, social affairs, human rights, and humanitarian affairs. Ambassador Shah was also selected and appointed as many social posts and experts in many international organizations. So without further ado, let's welcome Ambassador Shah to give the opening keynote. Mr. Shah, please.
Ambassador Shah, please.
Well, thank you, Chair. Distinguished participants, excellent ladies and gentlemen. I thank the organizer for the opportunity to address this forum. To begin with, let me first flag a few points. First, this year, the year 2020, marks the 70th anniversary of the United Nations. We should not miss the opportunity to take stock of the role of the United Nations, particularly where the United Nations system should face, where should it go. Second point, I believe it is not only necessary, but also imperative to look forward and backward after 75 years. What are the experiences which need to be carried forward? What are the lessons or shortcomings which should be overcome? Thirdly, personally speaking, we can imagine what the world would look like without the United Nations. I believe in the absence of the United Nations, perhaps the Third or Fourth World War may have taken place. More frequent economic and social crises may have happened. Firstly, multilateralism and its multilateral institutions need and should be further strengthened instead of being weakened to adapt to the fast-changing world. Last, the fifth point, with the UN, as we all know, it has three pillars. Right now, we have Security Council to address security issues, ECOSOC to address economic and social issues, Human Rights Council to address human rights issues. Of course, in addition, we have many other specialized agencies funding programs as multilateral institutions. We should look at them each and one by one, respectively. As colleagues know, I devote a great part of my career to multilateral diplomacy. First, on global security, and later on, global sustainable development. So, enhancing multilateralism is part of my professional life, my professional DNA. Sorry to be a bit personal. I also commend the organizers for focusing this event on Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. I had fortune to be the Secretary General of the year 2012 United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, also known as the Rio +20. Among the outcomes of the Rio +20 is the launch of the Global Journey on SDGs, which were adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in September 2015. On multilateralism, people ask, where do we stand? I beg to differ on the assessment of the concept note of this event. The note states that, I quote, a deeply worrying rise in unilateral sentiments across the globe has combined with the world's long-standing challenges to produce a crisis of confidence in multilateral institutions. End of the quote. The world does face long-standing challenges, but unilateral sentiments remains confined to a narrow segment of society, and its ugly rise is spurred by a few politicians. By no means do they represent the sentiments of the majority of United Nations member states. Recent surveys indicate that the great majority of the world's population believe in multilateralism and in multilateral institutions. There is one science-based reason for this. In our globalized world, we are interconnected. We share the same challenge in climate change, ocean acidification, air pollution, land degradation, loss of biodiversity, and the spread of diseases. The novel coronavirus, COVID-19, knows no national boundaries. We are in the same fragile boat, this beautiful and fragile planet Earth, floating in space. Our economies are interconnected. Growth in China will help drive growth in Asia, Europe, North America, and the developing world. Likewise, growth in Europe and elsewhere helps drive trade in developing countries, including China. Our rich and diverse cultures, woven into the splendid global mosaic of civilizations, make us richer and better spiritually and culturally. So, while we indeed face long-standing challenges, we have also developed multilateral institutions and multilateral processes to tackle them. For example, we have UNFCCC and Paris Agreement to combat climate change. We have WTO for fair and open trade. We have WHO for disease control. And we have UNESCO for advanced science, education, and culture. Putting any nation first against multilateralism, against these and other multilateral institutions is against the historic tide. It won't last long. On the way forward, I'm hopeful that multilateralism will prevail because it is the only way forward. So that's why I'm delighted with the title of this forum. The way forward to achieve SDGs is through fulfilling shared responsibility for a shared future, a future we all want. That is why building a community with a shared future for mankind is key to maintaining global peace and prosperity and to achieving the vision of the SDGs. So let us work together to strengthen multilateral institutions, bringing them up to date. Let us inject new energy into multilateral processes. Mark my words, the future belongs to multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Shah, for your opening keynote, and you have really outlined all this importance of multilateralism and all the UN different organizations' a great role in safeguarding and promoting multilateralism. Thank you, Ambassador Shah. Now I would like to also invite our next keynote speaker, which is also a great friend, and Mr. Jean-Pierre Raffarin. And Mr. Jean-Pierre Raffarin was a French Prime Minister from May 2002 to 2005. And he was senior lecturer at the Institut d'études politiques of Paris since 2007. He was president of the Regional Council of Piedmont-Charenton and presided over the Association of French Regions. Meanwhile, he was also a member of the European Parliament. He is elected the Senator of Benin and also occupied the position for Vice President of the Senate from March 2011 to September 2014. Moreover, he was President of the Foreign Affairs, Defense, and Armed Forces Committee of the Senate. Mr. Raffarin holds multiple positions on international stage. The
Nous avons eu une pandémie mondiale pour laquelle chacun a cherché une éradication nationale, pour laquelle globalement la priorité a été donnée à chaque nation et en Europe notamment les Allemands d'un côté, les Espagnols de l'autre, les Italiens, les Français, tous les autres, chacun faisait face dans la crise à ses préoccupations, mais globalement la coopération a été lente à se mettre en place et elle était difficile. Et on voit que globalement, nous avons eu un retour à des comportements unilatéraux. Et au fond, on peut s'inquiéter de cette montée de l'unilatéralisme dans les comportements des uns ou des autres, et notamment cette attitude du président américain qui, quelquefois, pose problème dans cette approche principalement unilatérale. Nous avons besoin de travailler ensemble et dans cette crise, on a même vu l'OMS, l'Organisation mondiale de la santé, fragilisée par la crise et par les différentes tensions internationales et le retrait d'une très grande puissance d'une organisation internationale n'est jamais pour le multilatéralisme une bonne chose parce qu'il faut être autour de la table pour ensemble faire face aux difficultés. Et ce n'est pas en quittant les organisations qu'on peut renforcer la démarche multilatérale. Qu'il faille faire des réformes, bien sûr que le système multilatéral a besoin d'une approche nouvelle. Bien sûr qu'il faut le réformer. Le monde d'aujourd'hui n'est pas le monde d'il y a 75 ans. L'Afrique, il y a 75 ans, n'est pas ce qu'est l'Afrique aujourd'hui. De même que l'Asie, la Chine ont pris une place depuis 75 ans qu'elles n'avaient pas au début de cette période du multilatéralisme naissant. Et donc, il est clair qu'il nous faut apporter des approches nouvelles dans cette gouvernance mondiale et qu'il nous faut inventer un multilatéralisme rénové. Mais il ne faut certainement pas détruire le multilatéralisme. Il ne faut certainement pas affaiblir nos institutions. Nous avons besoin, évidemment, de l'ONU. Il faut réformer le Conseil de sécurité, oui, mais il faut protéger l'ONU. C'est vrai qu'il faut élargir les questions d'éducation, mais il faut protéger l'UNESCO. Et c'est vrai que nous avons besoin, pour le vaccin et pour un certain nombre d'autres éléments de recherche en matière de santé, nous avons besoin de l'OMS. Il faut des réformes, mais il faut protéger nos organisations. C'est, je crois, un élément très important, cette idée d'un multilatéralisme rénové. Comment peut-on le rénover? Je vois rapidement 4 directions qui sont très importantes. Naturellement, en tenant compte de la priorité qui doit être la priorité supérieure, qui est la recherche de la paix, et qui consiste à concevoir la paix non pas comme quelque chose qui est donné, qui tombe du ciel.
Elevation and it's not about getting some pie dropping from the sky. We need to assure that all the efforts must be spent on that part. It's very crucial. We are not waiting. We need to do something. We need to enhance our cooperation and coordination mechanisms must be enhanced. And also we need to prevent the further crisis. That's also very crucial. We need upgraded new organizations, mechanisms to have closer cooperation between each other for further prevention of the new crisis. And in the peaceful way of cooperation instead of very interference. And we are defending the sovereignty. At the same time, we are weakening for fragility there. So mainly it's about multilateralism here. We need to set that as a priority, multilateralism, and that's very, very important against unilateralism. We are going toward this trend. We are marching forward. All we need is to have such a spiritual in our mind to start a dialogue between each other, no matter what's happening, no matter what challenges are lying before us, and no matter how huge pressure on our shoulders, we need to start our dialogue, and that will work. And though we use different language, sometimes we cannot solve all the problem at a time. But however, we can put all the challenges on the table, and we can start a dialogue, and through enhancing mutual understanding, it's much better than unilateralism. And after reforming, upgrading, progressing, we will make it better for sure. The third part, I would like to mention a little bit about the trend, the future forward. And we need to enhance multilateralism. And currently, we have a lot of regional, working on the regionalism or the unilateralism is prevailing. And facing such a challenge and difficulties lying in front of us, our EU is capable to solve such a challenge. In other part, it has a lot of difficulties. We need all institutions and our civilians and our societies need to cooperate, and we will coordinate different people's interests, no matter the private or public sector there, and to enhance and to use a revolutionary way and to upgrade multilateralism and to march it forward. I want to specialize in one point is that in the current world, like we have organizations like the women organizations, we have the civilization organizations, we have the human rights organizations, and women organizations are very important. So we need to ensure that female can play that role and to be more effective. And I think that women can be playing much more important role here and to be the very pillar and to enhance efficiency, especially for the young guys and like African people. And how we can get the young people in Africa, getting them engaged into the plans of our 2015 plans or 2020 plans, we need to ensure they can have more voice here. We want all the young people from the developing countries can get engaged into the development all together. I think that for the future and for the peace and co-development, we need to share our experience with them, and we need to let our children and young people to inherit from our very model of multilateralism and to carry it forward. And all the efforts and all the practices will be carried on. Multilateralism is a very good solution model. If everybody can looking forward and look far away, and we will say that the peace is our goal. Then across all the world, we know a lot of military schools, but there's no peace school. Peace school, we didn't say a lot of peace school. And it should not be happening like this. In the governance of globe, not only about to satisfy development in society, and we know that COVID-19 is spreading, outbreaking. And also we need to think that the COVID-19, apart from that, we know there are other issues like COVID-19 caused a lot of disasters and threats and causing a lot of unbalance, especially some vulnerabilities that are happening there to some countries without partners. We need to coordinate all the partners. We need everybody doing their part in the multilateralism and honor, with respect, and to achieve a very reconciling each other, and everybody can be peaceful. Thanks a lot for the organizer, and thanks so much for the title here, and thanks a lot for everybody's listening. Thank you.
I think it's really great. You have shared your unique perspective and give a lot of new thinking, and we really should safeguard multilateralism, and particularly in today's crisis of fighting COVID-19 and Merci beaucoup encore pour votre excellent speech. So thank you again very much. I appreciate your time to speak to us. Now, giving us we are here in China. I would also like to invite UN Ambassador to China, Nicholas Rossini, to give us a keynote. Nicholas is a UN resident coordinator and highest level representative of the UN in China. Mr. Rossini took up his assignment as the UN resident coordinator in the People's Republic of China in October 2016, and then he coordinates 24 UN agencies in China. He implemented the UN Development Cooperation with China. And prior to this, he served as a UNDP Deputy Assistant Administrator and the Deputy Regional Director for Asia and Pacific since January 2009. And most recently, he's also Director of Bangkok Regional Hub and also served as a UN Deputy Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Deputy Regional Director for Asia and Pacific, and most recently as the Director of Bangkok Regional Hub. So without further ado, we'll ask Mr. Rossini to give his keynote, but unfortunately he was on the airplane today to Shanghai, so he sent his recorded video, and we'll play his video to give his speech at this conference. Now let's have his video, please.
Mr. Wang, distinguished participants, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the United Nations in China, it is my great pleasure to join you in this virtual event in commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the United Nations with CCG and two leading Chinese think tanks, the Academy of Contemporary China and World Studies and the Tsinghua Center for International Security and Strategy. As you know, the UN was born in 1945, following the end of the Second World War, to preserve world peace and prevent future conflicts. In its early decades, the organization's primary mission was peacekeeping against the backdrop of Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, the United Nations was able to expand its focus on development and its field operations to tackle the pressing issues confronting humanity, such as poverty, food security, health, inequality, and many more. During my career at the UN, I witnessed this shift as the world's economy grew rapidly at unprecedented rates, and the international exchanges in the post-Cold War era stimulated technology-driven industrialization and deepened connectivity. Globalization has created immense benefits and opportunities, enabling more efficient supply chains, creating jobs that have brought millions of people out of poverty, and accelerating digitalization. While we reap the dividends of fast social and economic growth, we should also be aware that if we fail to ensure fair globalization and sustainability, we will have to bear the consequences of amplified inequality and exacerbated environmental degradation. In 2020, the world faces the gravest challenge since World War II, the COVID-19 pandemic. Every country is struggling to absorb the unfolding shock from this health crisis. Unemployment rates have increased, businesses have suffered, inequalities within and between countries have grown, and the progress on poverty reduction has reversed. The COVID-19 pandemic is a stark reminder of the need for cooperation across borders, sectors, and generations, the importance of aligning development strategies with sustainability principles, and the urgency to mobilize action towards the Sustainable Development Goals. This year has already been described as a time of opportunity for a profound systemic shift to a more sustainable economy that works for both people and the planet. The year 2020 also marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. To combat the pandemic, now more than ever, we need to reaffirm our global commitment towards the principles of the United Nations Charter and towards achieving the 2030 Agenda. No government and no organization will be able to recover from the devastation of the pandemic and achieve the SDGs alone. All parts of society, including national and local government, civil society, think tanks, youth, the media, businesses and academia, will have to work in partnership to leverage this moment of crisis and take bold steps to steer the world back on track towards the Sustainable Development Goals. On the occasion of its 75th anniversary, the United Nations is holding online dialogues around the world to offer an opportunity and a platform for people to brainstorm and discuss priorities, envisage the future we want, and define how enhanced international cooperation can help realize our vision by 2045, the UN's 100th birthday. This survey places special emphasis on youth and those whose voices are too often marginalized or not heard in global affairs, but who are and will be the most affected by our actions today. I appreciate the efforts of CCG, the Academy of Contemporary China and World Studies, and the Tsinghua Center for International Security and Strategy for bringing together diplomats, scholars, and leaders from various sectors together to exchange their insights. I also wish to take the opportunity to invite all of you to join UN 75 online dialogues to share your experiences and vision for a better future. I look forward to closer collaboration with all of you on the UN 75 global conversation and on our many other common goals to inspire constructive ideas and actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rossini. Actually, also he has made a lot of contribution to China, and he has actually testified on that. So, so it's really great. We have all the UN representatives on our forum, and I'm sure we also have hear more from subsequent our panel. We have many UN agency representatives. Now I'd like to introduce our fourth keynote speaker, Madame Gabriela Ramos. Madame Gabriela Ramos is the OECD Chief of Staff and also Shepherd to the G20. She is responsible for the contribution of the OECD to the global agenda, including the G20, G7, and APEC. She held several positions in Mexico government and launched a consultants forum leading major environmental and social projects. Later, she served as director of OECD office in Mexico and Latin America, coordinating quite a few reports and activities to advance the health and education reform in the country. And now she has been in OECD for quite some time, and she's really demonstrated a strong leadership in OECD-related activities. Now it's a great pleasure to invite Madame Gabriela Ramos to deliver her keynote. Madame Ramos, please.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I really want to thank the Center for China and Globalization and the Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute for this very good call. As we have heard from previous speakers, if any, this global pandemic, this global problem we have in terms of the health systems, in terms of the impact on lives, in terms of the impacts on livelihoods, in terms of the impact of the economy, require a global response. But it also felt at the moment where multilateralism is called into question, where the first reaction by leaders in many countries is just to look inward and not to go outward for solutions that we know only the international system can provide. And therefore, this discussion is very important because we have now a possibility of looking first of how this global problem happened and how do we solve it through international cooperation, or how are we going to rebuild a world and look for solutions that are only answering the national considerations, and this will be suboptimal. And we should not forget that even in the context of this pandemic, we really need to strive and continue with the effort to address the global challenges as identified by the United Nations, as identified by the SDGs, as identified by the Paris Climate Agreement, because it's also true that we knew that pandemic happens, big problems on health issues happen. They know no frontier, and we were not really well prepared. I think this is one of the lessons, and this is something that we need to bring to the table to come back together. So, and COVID is also a tragic reminder of what is really important for us as human beings: the good physical and mental health, the environmental context, the social connections, education, and this health crisis made us reevaluate our priorities and to really find out what we treasure the most. The health impact have been terrible, and we are with the thousands of people that have lost their lives, or they have lost a family or a relative. The confinement measures that have to be taken because the health systems were not prepared to cope with this pandemic have been also devastating. And as many of the speakers have mentioned, these measures come at the top of a situation that was already very fragile. It was fragile because of the protectionist measures in international trade or international economy, but also the results of a growth model that left so many people behind. At the OECD, we have been documenting for the last 10 years the increase in inequalities of income and opportunities, not only in developing countries and the most backward regions, but even in the most advanced economies. This has been a trend: concentration at the top, deprivation at the bottom. And the COVID has also showed these vulnerabilities. Because when you have a crisis, what happens is you test the resilience and you test the strength of the systems as you have them. And we know that they have not been performing very well. And that includes the multilateral system. What happens is that the confinement measures had to be very tough to allow for the health system to cope with the problem. And what we see at the OECD is that because we don't have a vaccine, and we will need to live with the virus for the time to come until we find a cure or we find a medicine or a vaccine, the fact is that the impact on the economy is going to be really important. But there's lots of uncertainty because we don't know if there's going to be a second wave. We are now seeing some cases again in China and in Korea. We see countries like mine, Mexico or Brazil or the US really suffering and being the epicenter of the pandemic now. But we're not free from it until we really have a vaccine. And therefore, in our latest economic outlook at the OECD, we had two scenarios. It's the very first time since the creation of the OECD that we have two scenarios because we don't have real certainty of what is going to prevail. One scenario assumes that we control the pandemic, and the fall in the GDP, global GDP, is going to be around 6%. It's already very, very high. But if there was to be a second wave in Europe and in the countries that have already controlled the pandemic, like China or Korea, the fall will be around 7.5%. And this is really, as I said, coming on top of high debt levels of the corporates, of high levels of inequality, of climate challenges, on the fact that children, women, and I commend the comment by Mr. Raffaran on the women role on all these challenges, but they are taking the hardest hit. Women represent 70% of the workforce and are not the best paid workers in the health force. They take care of the long-term care in our families, of children, and then they also have less leverage. They are the weakest part of our societies, but the same with youth. So I would say that when we go back to look for answers, multilateral answers, we need to find people-centered responses. People-centered that respond to youth, that respond to children, the child that could not be connected, that cannot continue with their schooling at home. These are the kind of answers that we need to bring for the multilateral system, because it's also true that as long as the people in the street don't see what does it mean for them to have this fantastic multilateral system based on the United Nations, is not going to get the support that we need when it takes for the democratic processes that have brought us so many populist leadership. So this is the kind of issues that we need to be building up. We need to build again, creating the jobs for people to live or to deliver in this situation. So the real question here is, how do we not only address the impact of the pandemic, but how do we rebuild? And as the Secretary General of United Nations have said, and now we are all borrowing his words, how do we build back better? And there might be a silver lining, because if any, we discover the vulnerability as human beings, we discover the vulnerability as societies, and we also discover the vulnerability of our international infrastructure to deal with these issues. So I hope that the main message will be, again, that the only way is to go international. The only way is to go through cooperation, because it's the only way in which we will be achieving the global solutions. First, because we need to learn from each other, and we need to learn why some countries have managed much better than others. Of course, it's different. If you are very open to tourism, if you are very open to international global value chains like France or like Italy, of course, the hit is going to be hardest. But the fact is also true that some health systems were better prepared. Germany has 3 times the average of beds and doctors than the OECD, 39% per 100,000 people. So they have the room, they're more resilient, because resilience is another element that was found lacking. How do we learn from the Korean experience of the TTT strategy? How do we learn from the many areas in which all these countries have really developed an effective solution? But how do we also anticipate any future shocks, and how do we build up from this experience to be better prepared? Second, because some of the issues can only be developed jointly, we are now looking for the vaccine. The OECD has been saying for more than a decade that there's not enough investment, international investment, private investment in the production of vaccines. These investments are very expensive, and the returns are not so great, and therefore there is a market failure that should have been addressed. And therefore then there is this reconsideration. For many years, we have had this idea that governments and that the state should only intervene in the economy whenever there are market failures. But we see now that there are too many market failures that pose a real problem for societies. And therefore the markets for vaccines, the market for medicines should be revised. And as President Macron mentioned, there are some global goods that cannot be left to the markets alone. But this has to be done again through multilateral cooperation. How do we spur the R&D that is needed? How do we coordinate on managing intellectual property rights, procurement, access to medical equipment? You saw all the things that happened during the pandemic. And then third, because we need international cooperation after countries come up with a huge debt, after all the fiscal efforts that they have to put together to keep the economy going, we will need to rethink and look for innovative ways to dealing with the recovery. If we are going to be just trying to cope with the debt levels, the recovery will be very slow, and then you would not have the growth rates that you need actually to overcome the debt problem. And that's why at the OECD, we are continuing to build up the international tax infrastructure with an inclusive framework, and to consider the question of digital tax, because tax evasion and tax erosion is something that we need to deal with if we want strong governments, a strong governance system. And so if you think about trade, it's also only multilateral. We are now seeing this backlash against the supply chains that were built in the just in time, and people are saying, well, now we need the just in case. We need to build buffers. We cannot be highly dependent on certain products and certain countries. But at the same time, you cannot just go back and try to be self-sufficient, because that's not going to happen without causing huge harm to the international system. So this is very important. So we need to turn this crisis into an opportunity to enhance multilateral cooperation. The post-COVID world that we envision, it's a new growth narrative that is people-centered. Of course, the SDGs already provide this guidance to us. It's multidimensional. It has very concrete elements on how to look at sustainability, inclusiveness, efficiency, without giving primacy to just a single objective, as we have done with the efficiency. And building back better means greener, but also enhance inclusiveness and resilience. It means not forgetting those at the bottom, don't forgetting the developing and the low-income countries that are still suffering. We need to keep the commitments on ODA. We need to keep the commitments on financing. It's important that we keep the solidarity that has been built in the system for many years to ensure that we have better outcomes. And against this background, Stop UN must rise to these challenges. The fact that those same 193 countries came together in 2015, only 5 years ago, to agree on the 2030 agenda and its 17 SDG goals, is an example of the huge potential that this organization has. We are supportive. The Secretary General in the OECD always says that we are support cast, as if we are in Hollywood movies, because the United Nations is the center of the multilateral cooperation, and we should all support it. So I hope that we will continue pushing for this idea that multilateralism is the only way. I hope that we will be able to show those leaders that today are refusing or turning their back to multilateralism that is very costly to do so. And I hope that all of us that believe that through international cooperation we can achieve better outcomes will stick together. And that's why I'm very glad to join you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madame Ramos, for your excellent speech as well. And you talk about cooperation, and also let's turn the crisis into opportunity. So it's really a great talk that we all need to focus on. So thank you again very much. And now our final keynote, and I would like to introduce Ambassador Yi Xiaozhun. Ambassador Yi Xiaozhun began his first term as a Deputy Director General of the WTO on 2013. And he has been reappointed for the second four-year term, starting 2017. He represented China as a key negotiator in China's WTO accession process, making an important contribution to the negotiation of China joining WTO. Minister Yi was China's Vice Minister for Commerce in charge of multilateral and regional trade negotiations and cooperation. He played a leading role in negotiating numerous free trade agreements, including China-ASEAN Agreement, China First FTA, and also advanced China's involvement with Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, and Asia-Europe meeting, ASEAN, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNICHAD, and Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and the 10+3 East Asia Summit and related high-level meetings. So we are also very lucky we got Minister Yi, Ambassador Yi present today as well. So we have an organization from OECD, from WTO, from UN. So Ambassador Yi, please, your turn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wang. I first want to thank CCG for organizing this timely forum. Let me start with a confession. I am a multilateralist. As mentioned by Mr. Wang, I spent my whole career to promote multilateral trading system. I firmly believe that there's no other way to deal with today's global challenges, from trade to the environment to human health, than through global cooperation. The COVID-19 crisis has strengthened, not weakened, the logic of multilateralism. Global recovery will depend on countries sharing information, cooperating on treatments, and keeping the world economy open. In a pandemic that knows no borders, one country's crisis is everyone's crisis. The danger we face is not just the pandemic, but international discord and fragmentation. Against that background, I believe the core objectives of the multilateral trading system are as valid today as when they were first set out after the Second World War. The system was a response to the chaos of the first half of the 20th century. It was based on a simple but powerful idea that global peace depended on global prosperity. Trade would fuel growth and development. Rules would promote security and fairness. Interdependence would give countries a stake in each other's success. That vision has succeeded spectacularly. Trade has expanded an astonishing 37-fold since 1945. Global output has increased 8-fold. In the last 25 years alone, 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. The irony is that the challenge facing us today, managing a highly integrated and multipolar global economy, is the product not of the system's failure, but of its success. If the multilateral system is under strain today, it is partly because it has not kept up with the dynamic global economy it helped to create. If the multilateral system is under strain today, not kept up with it helped to create rule book. The last major reform of the system took place 25 years ago during the Uruguay round, which is before explosion of the internet, the spread of GVCs, and China's accession to the WTO. The COVID crisis has only accelerated economic change, especially the shift to digitalization, putting even more pressure on WTO rules to catch up. The good news is that WTO reform is already happening. Where possible, WTO members are harvesting multilateral agreements, such as the 2013 Accord on Trade Facilitation, the 2015 Agreement of Agriculture Export Subsidies, and ongoing talks on curbing fishery subsidies. Groups of like-minded members are also exploring potential new rules on e-commerce, investment facilitation, and making it easier for small businesses to trade. This push for WTO reform is not new. The system has been evolving and adapting since its creation. But the choice today is not between reform and the status quo. It's between reform and irrelevance. Obviously, WTO reform depends on countries cooperating, not vice versa. And this depends on restoring mutual trust. It's not the lack of WTO reform that stands in the way of members cooperating. It's lack of cooperation that stands in the way of WTO reform. Moreover, restoring trade cooperation fundamentally depends on restoring trust, especially between the world's major economies. Without trust, there can be no cooperation, and without cooperation, there can be no effective WTO. Here comes my final point, that multilateral cooperation is messy and complicated, but it's also indispensable to managing our interconnected economies. The alternative to an open, cooperative, and rules-based multilateral system is a more closed, divided, and power-based one, where trade relations are determined by coercion, where economies turn inward, and where businesses face an increasingly uncertain and disorderly future. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Yi, and for your also very stimulating speech. Actually, cooperation and is really important, and WTO is a testimony of the success of the global trade. But also, we need innovation and we need the cooperation. So to put it forward, so it's very crucial for the innovation. Thank you very much for your keynote. Now we have concluded our keynote portion of our webinar, and I want to thank all our keynote very much. Actually, you formed a very good framework actually for our continuous discussion, and we have medias from China and also international medias. We have quite a lot of people watching us, and I think that's really great that we have a very great discussion on this general topic that concern every country and everyone actually in their mind. So it's a great occasion at this 75th anniversary of UN that we actually have a brainstorm of the future of the UN and also the global system. So now I'll continue with our first distinguished panel discussion. We're a bit behind schedule, so probably we'll try to shorten a bit of the next two panels. The first panel is, we'll have an hour probably to discuss that, and it's called Multilateralism at Crossroad. Just like we heard, WTO is at the crossroad as well. So the challenges, prospects, and innovation for global governance in a changing world. And we are also very fortunate today. We have 6 very distinguished speakers join us. And so I will just chair this according to the alphabetic order, and just to be easier. So the first panelist will be Mr. David Chavinade, and he's the Chief of Cabinet of the Director General of United Nations Office at Geneva. So we'll have probably let's have a 5-7 minutes of a talk, and then we'll probably save some time for Q&A. We got quite a few Q&A from different media groups. So if you can, if we can take a bit of a more concise talk, that'd be great. So Mr. Chavinade, please. Your
Thank
turn.
you, President Wang Huiyao. Mr. President, Chairman Yakunin, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to be invited to address the very timely conference, which has brought together some of the most prominent thinkers and practitioners from around the world. Last year marked the 100th anniversary of modern multilateralism, tracing its lineage from the Versailles Treaty of 1919 and the League of Nations. And this year we mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. There is reason to look back with satisfaction. Extraordinary advancements have been made in peace, rights, and well-being since the end of the Second World War. However, 2 decades into the 21st century, we find ourselves facing increasingly complex, interlocking challenges, a climate crisis wreaking havoc around the world, armed conflicts threatening millions, dire poverty in large parts of the world, refugee flows at record levels, rampant inequality both between and within countries, escalating disputes over trade, sky-high debt, threats to the rule of law, the methodical and deliberate dismantling of disarmament commitments, attacks on the media and civil society, and much more. We're also seeing increasingly militaristic rhetoric and activities, growth in nationalistic and isolationist politics of fear and resentment, and the burgeoning role of technology in the private sector, including social media, in international relations. With the disappearance of the so-called bipolar world, the international community has not yet managed to define what arrangement would impart to the world the strategic stability that is sorely lacking today. This is most evident at the quote-unquote top. The relationships within the triangle of the most powerful nations are deeply dysfunctional and unstable, which is, and in and of itself, enough to engender instability throughout the world. Add to that a number of medium powers that are becoming unpredictable regional players increasingly willing to use force to further their own interests with no accountability towards any particular power center. The disastrous state of affairs in nuclear disarmament is boosting a dangerous, unregulated arms race that is being replicated on regional and country levels. Geopolitically, we're living in a world of great asymmetries and fragmentation at all levels: political, economic, and security. To say that the world is in transition would be a gross understatement. What we're living today is not a routine change of environment, rather a pivotal moment which only occurs maybe every other century. A new social and economic paradigm is emerging, and we all need to join forces to ensure that these changes have positive impact on all. The dramatic and fast evolving human, social, and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic only strengthens further this point. At the start of 2020, who could have imagined that a disease outbreak could turn the world upside down in such a short time and in such a dramatic way? Global challenges of such magnitude require concerted collective responses. Yet, as Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently observed, multilateralism is under fire precisely when we need it most. In this watershed moment for humankind that is 2020, we need to develop a more modern multilateralism, one that is more inclusive and collaborative. Similarly, leadership in the 21st century must come from all quarters and all levels. Gone is the time for a handful of leaders and small groups of countries to make decisions for everyone. We constantly hear from different quarters statements that question the relevance and role of the United Nations as the universal international organization. True, it was created 75 years ago by leaders who fashioned it according to the world landscape of the day. However, today, member states are not stepping up to fine-tune and strengthen their organization, resorting instead to starving it of funds and demanding that the bureaucracy reform itself. More importantly, all these constant pressures are applied primarily to the UN Secretariat, whereas the UN system as a whole remains more or less untouched. On a more optimistic note, global challenges are also global opportunities. They can only be addressed collectively. This reality is reflected in the policy frameworks of 2015. Ironically, the same governments that are drawing further and further apart on the vital security, economic, and social issues today found it possible to come together 5 years ago in 2015 to reach agreements on truly historic measures. The Paris Accords on climate change, the Agreement on Financing for Development, and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. This gives us a unique chance to shape a new governance landscape, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is our common roadmap. Ladies and gentlemen, at different times throughout the centuries, the world powers of the day turned to multilateralism only after some prolonged, devastating conflict that they had either blundered or charged into left them no choice but to sit down and talk, negotiate, and take into account a balance of interests of all parties. Today's challenges and attacks on multilateralism and the seeming inability of the international community to re-engage and work together to stem, in the words of the United Nations Secretary General, the wind of madness sweeping the globe, do not bode well. We seem to be on the verge of blundering into something far more devastating than the world has experienced before for a variety of reasons, not least among them unusually deteriorated relations among the most heavily armed and powerful states, a climate catastrophe that is already at our doorstep, the dark side of the unprecedented quantum leaps in technological development, the deficit of trust among peoples, countries, communities, and societies. Add to that the game-changing COVID-19 pandemic, and what the world has before it is a stage set for planetary calamity. We need to pull back from the precipice in time. Multilateralism, modern multilateralism, is the only way to do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Daisy, and for your very comprehensive talk as well. I think you're right. The populism, nationalism pose a lot of threat to the multilateralism, and we have to really face the challenges, how we can overcome those challenges. And I think UN is very important to continue to play those important roles in promoting multilateralism. I also want to mention Mr. Davy is also serving as Chief of Staff of the UN office at Geneva, and he has worked for over 33 years for the foreign government and international civil services. So he's a very experienced international organization promoter as well. So he's really has many activities and functions that he's played in the past 33 years. Now I would like to invite Mr. Minister Michi Gerci, the former Undersecretary of the State at the Italian Ministry of Economic and Development. Professor Gerci is a former Undersecretary of State in the Italian Ministry of Economic and Development, responsible for international trade and investment in the Content One cabinet. Prior to that, he actually lived in 10 years in China, and also he spent 20 years in London, in many functions in the past of North China and Europe and also international very well. So now we have Minister Michel Gerci to speak. You have to unmute your speaker.
Many thanks, Director President Wang. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Many thanks to Dr. Iaconin, and I've heard with great interest the former speeches. Thanks again to Mr. Zucan, and of course to Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin. As we have been talking about multilateralism, and even you, President Wang, have just mentioned populism. I give you a 4 minutes view on how we can try to bridge the gap. I think the world needs indeed to be open. We need to continue to interact with each other. And as a former member of the Italian government, maybe a government that was amongst the populist government, I can give you a little bit of insight from the inside. What has happened is that I think leaders in the both developed and developing world, they need to see the benefits of multilateralism. The general narrative in the last couple of years has been that free trade, openness has indeed narrowed the gap between developing countries and developed countries. So it has been beneficial for inter-country disparities. It has, however, created disparity within countries. So we have had the growth of income disparity in countries. And I give you an example of my country. In Italy, about 75–80% of the population have standard of living now that are lower than what they were 20 years ago. So over the last 20 years, 80% of the population has suffered a decline in the standard of living. Now, for the general politician, it is hard to justify to continue the route without addressing those issues. This is why we have flirted with the idea of universal basic income. That is a topic that we are bringing onto the table. Just now, after the COVID-19, it becomes a little bit more urgent, exactly what I heard before, to look after the weak, the weakest section of the economy. You know, as an economist and trade economist, I see free trade that brings gain, but it is also a Darwinian process. It rewards the strong ones, those who adapt, but it leaves behind the weak ones, those that need time, maybe those who are old in their career, and they do not have the time, the skills, and even the money to reinvent into a new and retrain into a new career. And so I think the role for politicians is to compensate, to provide a buffer for those sectors of the economy that otherwise by themselves they cannot do it. So trade is good. We are open to trade, but I think we need, and this is the role of think tank like CCG and others, and I'm very happy to be here today. My suggestion is, it's an invitation to all of you, and do please get in touch with me to move on and try to be practical, provide analysis. Politicians need numbers. We can tell them multilateralism is good, but we need to know by how much, we need to know for which sectors, we need to know for which regions. And I give you an example. At the European Commission, when I was representing Italy in G20 meetings in Buenos Aires, in Japan recently, but in Brussels, I used to tell the Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström, you know, Cecilia, when we do impact analysis of free trade agreements between the EU and Vietnam, the EU and Canada, we need to not just do the analysis at the EU level for the block of the 28. We need to go one level deeper and do 28 analyses for each of the member states, so that Italian, Hungarian, French, Germans, they don't just go back to their own people and say this agreement is good for Europe. Politicians need to say this is good for Europe and this is also good for our country. Because when things are good for the 28, now 27 members, the sum of 27 pluses is indeed a plus also for the bloc. And if China and the United States and other trading blocs have their own plus signs in front, then it would be a plus sign for the whole world. The opposite is not true. If we have a plus sign for a wider bloc, that does not necessarily mean that each of the components will also benefit. And we may have what I call these intra-bloc disparities that create frictions. Italian thinks that there is something wrong with the German trade deficit. The Germans think there's something wrong with Italian fiscal policies, and we never solve the issues. And that's why my really advice and the invitation to all of you is to bring back the analysis on the table of policy makers, because with numbers in front of them, the discussion, and I found it, becomes easy to solve, because it's very hard to disagree with the scientific analysis, you know, as a scientific, as a social science and economics can be, but it would be a great improvement, including the so often discussed WTO reforms that we have been brought to the G20 table. We just need to understand what is happening and how we can make this organization move on and really bring the trading blocks together. So knowledge, competence, communication, debates, and analysis is at the key of making the UN, WTO, and all these organizations live into the post-virus world. And the two key words that I leave you is Belt and Road and Africa. And I stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Minister Michele Gerci, for your, also very stimulating talk from Italian perspective as well. And actually, our panelists this time, we have so many from region organizations. It's really an excellent panel of great minds meet together, and we're actually going to record all the great speeches and also your great views, and then we want to amplify that in China and also internationally. Talking about numbers, next I would like to invite Mr. Dr. Martin Reiser. He's the country director for China and Mongolia and Korea World Bank Group. So Dr. Reiser is leading actually a team at this and is managing one of the World Bank's largest loan portfolios and direct extensive analytical and advisory program in China and Mongolia. So he's a very professional at what he's doing and had a growing knowledge and partnership with Korea as well. China and Korea and Mongolia, he's now looked after. He has worked for the Cairo Institute at the World Economics and the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, where he was the director of a country strategy and editor of the translation report. So recently we actually had the CCG had an event with collaborated with the World Bank, and where World Bank just released very alarming numbers that world economy is going to decline 5.2% this year, and developed economy is going to decline, become negative 7%. Whereas probably China is the only country, large economy, that is growing at 1% this year. So I would like to have Martin, Dr. Reiser, to give your perspective as a World Bank representative in our multilateral system, how we going forward. Dr. Reiser, please.
Thank you, Henry, and distinguished co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Many speakers have said this before. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. Many speakers have said this before, but for me, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations is first of all a moment to reflect on how much has been achieved since the UN and my own institution, the World Bank, were founded at the end of the devastating Second World War. I think Prime Minister Raffarin has already pointed to the fact that in 1950, around 2/3 of the world's population were living below $1.9 per day. And today the share is only about 10%, while the absolute number of poor people has fallen by over half, from 1.6 billion to around 650 million people. This is also the 40th anniversary of the World Bank Group's partnership with China, 2020. And I want to use the opportunity to highlight the huge contribution that China itself has made to the global progress that we've seen in the fight against poverty. Of course, most importantly, by reducing the number of poor within China, but more recently also as a growing contributor to IDA, the World Bank's development financing arm for the low-income countries. The multilateral institutions have been an important anchor for the global collaboration that has made this progress possible. As advocates, as platforms for discussion and exchange of ideas, as repositories of knowledge, and as providers of long-term concessional development finance. The UN, the IMF, the MDBs have all made important contributions. Today, these contributions are needed more than ever. COVID-19 has plunged the world into the deepest recession since the end of the Second World War. Henry, you mentioned our report. We estimate that 95% of the world's economies are expected to contract this year, and global growth will fall by an estimated 5.2%. This could bring more than 70 million people back below the $1.9 per day poverty line. And while the pandemic has affected rich and poor countries alike, the poor and vulnerable have been particularly hard hit by the lack of access to health services, loss of jobs and income, and the inability of many governments in developing countries, for fiscal reasons, to find the resources to expand social safety nets and support the economy as much as required. The pandemic has not just had global economic implications, it has also revealed once again how connected our economies and societies are. From global food markets to global value chains, from the concerted global efforts to improve treatment protocols and find a vaccine, to the provision of cross-border liquidity by central banks of major economies. The pandemic has demonstrated that our problems are shared, and so must be the solutions. The multilateral institutions are leaning forward. The World Bank Group, for example, is expected to provide around $160 billion in financing to developing countries over the next 15 months, with more than half of this going to low-income countries. But let me close with three more open reflections on the multilateral system. The multilateral system can only be as strong as our member states and shareholders want it to be. So I want to reflect on three issues in that regard, specific to perhaps the situation of national financial institutions. First, for the international financial institutions, it's clear that the financial resources at our disposal are falling well short of what is required to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and to effectively mitigate against risks of crises, such as the one we're currently living through. Many see this as a challenge of relevance, but I would argue it is also a reflection of the success of globalization that development does not rely on official financing alone. What we in the multilateral institutions need to learn to do more effectively is how to catalyze funding for sustainable development, how to turn our billions into the trillions that are needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Second, with the emergence of new development players, the question of coordination and agreement on international standards for development cooperation becomes ever more important. The re-emergence of a debt crisis in many of the poorest countries is both a reflection of the shortcomings of such cooperation and the need for it going forward. Multilateralism should be about the prevention of repeating the mistakes of the past. And in that regard, we have made a lot of progress internationally to agree international social and environmental standards, agreements on debt transparency, etc., which are important to make sure that that development coordination happens. It would be desirable that the new development players find a way to also accept these standards and find a way to make their international development assistance more aligned with these standards. Third, as the center of economic gravity in the world is shifting to the developing countries, the question is how to reflect this in the structures of global governance. Greater voice and representation for development countries is desirable, just as we need to strive to make sure that our staff are more diverse. This diversity will enrich multilateralism, but it has to be based on a consensus on what development consists in, which is why I was referring to the standards in my earlier point. If we can agree on what good development means, what good development outcomes are, it should be easier also to make more space for the voices of the new emerging players in the multilateral system to be more clearly reflected. If, on the other hand, these differences in opinion are not resolved, it will become more difficult to make space for a more inclusive global governance. And so I would invite the new emerging development players, including China, to engage in the discussion of what global development should look like, and to reaffirm their commitment to the standards if indeed they agree that these standards are the right ones to follow. I think in that regard, I'm optimistic that multilateralism is not only required as a solution to our future development problems, but will also be successful in addressing them. With that, let me close and thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Rizzo, and for your also very stimulating talk. I think that's correct. The emerging economy and how to reflect that into the structural changes that our global system evolving is really fundamental. I think you talk about standards also, very important, how we can come up with the common understanding of the standards so that we can have a better improvement of the emerging economy at a multilateral system. It is something needs to be more think deep about. So thank you for your contribution. Now I would like to invite Dr. Justin Vassin. He's the Director General and also the founder of Paris Peace Forum. I know that Dr. Vassin actually was he issued the Paris Peace Forum 2 years ago at the 100-year anniversary of the First World War, where French President Macron launched this Paris Peace Forum, and basically is a platform for vertical globalization, given Justin's words, or vertical multilateralism. So Dr. Vassin is the founder and Director General of the Paris Peace Forum, and prior to this role, Justin was the Director of Policy Planning at the French Minister of Foreign Affairs. And Dr. Vassin also served as the Director of Research for the Center on United States and Europe, and also as a Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. So that's where I first met Dr. Vassin. So now, Justin, it's your turn, please.
Thank you, Henry. It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot for these very interesting comments that we've heard since the beginning. Let me jump right into the issue. When you talk about security, when you talk about trade, there's no doubt that states remain at the center of the game. There's no reason when you talk, let's say, about nuclear non-proliferation to involve NGOs, philanthropic foundations, companies, etc. However, for the rest of the international issues, for most of them, actually, whether you talk about health and COVID-19, whether you talk about biodiversity, climate, but also cybersecurity or the digital world in general, there's no reason to exclude all of these other actors. And on the contrary, there's nothing you can actually do by only government fiat, that is to say, by the pure multilateral game only. And so the Paris Peace Forum was founded 2 years ago on this premise, the idea that, you know, you can call it vertical multilateralism, that is to say, integrating other actors than states. You can call it, as Pascal Lamy, the president of the Paris Peace Forum, calls it, polylateralism, or, you know, any word of jargon that you can find. But the idea remains, it is that for certain issues, for certain international issues, we need to include other actors than states. The world is not only Westphalian, even though it is. And given the rapid state of disintegration of multilateralism, I would go as far as that assessment. Multilateralism has been degrading for the past 10, 20 years, but this has been accelerating in the recent month because of great power tensions, because of populist leaders turning their back on multilateralism, etc. We need to defend multilateralism, but also to rebuild it. And rebuilding it also means expanding it to other actors. Let me give you a very concrete example. We all know that our common future depends on finding a vaccine and distributing a vaccine, not just finding it for the richest country and the middle classes of the US, Europe, and China for that matter. And so how will we do that? Of course, states have an important role to play, but the WHO has an important role to play. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has an important role to play. The Wellcome Trust has an important role to play. CEPI, Gavi, UNITAID, the World Fund for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis all have an important role to play. And all of these actors together can make a difference. State by themselves will not, especially in these days when we have so much competition and so much introversion, I would say, on this. But the fact remains that there's only one cyber world, there's only one health, there's only one climate, and only one planet. And so what we need to do is foster the meeting and coordination of all of these different actors. And that's really why the Paris Peace Forum was founded with a Westphalian basis, a Westphalian core. States remain at the center of the game, but associating all of the others in order to make a difference. Let me give you another example, something that strikes all of us, including health facilities, including the WHO and others, cyber attacks or cybersecurity in general. What the Paris Peace Forum has done is to work in complement of the UN, which is and remains the legitimate body which we should all strengthen. Starting in 2006, there was a GEG, a group of governmental experts working on cybersecurity. It reached certain results, like the applicability of international law to the cyber world. That was in 2014. But starting in 2016, 2017, it really basically collapsed and didn't give any results. But that's also when we saw many more cyber attacks, NotPetya, WannaCry, and all of the other viruses that you have heard about, and that are striking not only companies, but also states, but also hospitals. Remember the NHS in the UK, civilian systems, etc. And so a certain number of actors banded together, from Siemens and Microsoft to governments and civil society group, and insisted on doing something. And that something was launched at the first Paris Peace Forum, the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which now gathers more than 1,000 signatories, almost 80 governments, 600 companies from around the world, including Huawei, for example, and or Kaspersky from Russia and others, and agreeing on a number of principles and putting some norms into this sector, which really didn't, which really is not very well regulated or very well governed. And what happened was, by bringing this, it sort of helped re-energize what we saw at the UN, that is the resurrection of the group of governmental experts and the open-ended group on cybersecurity, the open-ended working group on cybersecurity, which now are starting to make progress towards some kind of governance and regulation of cybersecurity. So I went into this example a bit in detail to show that multi-actor initiatives like the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, or you could mention ACT-A, the access to COVID-19 tools, the initiative that was taken by the EU, France, a number of governments, but also the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, CEPI, Gavi, and others. These multi-actor initiatives are often effective at answering our challenges, and I would add, at rejuvenating multilateralism. One last word on the third edition of the forum, which I should add as a great lineup of northern and southern members in it, in the executive committee, as well as in the steering committee where, Henry, you sit for the Center for China and Globalization. The third edition will be, once again, in November in Paris. It will, because of the General Assembly, G7 and COP26 have been pretty much either cancelled or downsized, and the G20, we hope, will give results, but we don't know yet, will be the first real international meeting in person after, we hope, the bulk of COVID-19 has passed. And so there's a special responsibility which we will have with the heads of state, with the CEOs, the heads of large NGOs, international organization. We will focus on the solutions to the crisis. First, global governance of health. We know there are reforms to be made. We'll have Dr. Tedros present, we'll have Bill Gates, we'll have all the major players present on that issue. Second is the issue of development. And we talked about the financing of development a bit earlier. What we're doing this year at the Paris Peace Forum is have the first ever summit of development banks, which will happen on November 12th. It's called Finance in Common, and it will gather the 450 public development banks around the world. There are as many as 450. Most of them are completely unknown. They are local, regional, sub-regional banks. They're not as well known as the big multilateral banks like the World Bank and others, but together they represent 10% of annual investment in the world. And I think in 2020, it will actually be more than 10%. And we will gather them in order to strengthen the response to COVID-19 in terms of counter-cyclical action, and more importantly, to try to get them to commit to aligning their investment with the SDGs, with Agenda 2030 on the one hand, and with climate goals on the other hand. If these 10% of investment respect the objectives and the guidelines of the SDGs and climate, then we'll all be better off, especially because they have a big impact on private investment as well. And then the third and last issue that we will tackle is the digital world, with this issue of cybersecurity I just mentioned, but also with the issue of rights, the issue of private data. Contact tracing is a great answer to COVID-19, but how much do we want to give our private data to these systems? Robin Lee, for example, the CEO of Baidu, has asked the question recently, and he's right, I think. And so we'll work on this issue. And lastly, also work on infodemics. What is called infodemics, it's an old problem we know about the platforms on the internet, that is fake news, manipulation, etc. But during the pandemic, we've seen a proliferation of fake news and false information on COVID-19, which have sometimes been pretty harmful to a lot of people. And so we should take another look at how we best regulate these sphere of information without infringing free speech. So, bottom line, I give you all sort of an invitation to come and join us in November in Paris from November 11 to 13 for the third edition of the forum. It will be a hybrid edition. It will be both in presence, in physical presence, and online, because we know that's a very special year. But we'll maintain the physical presence with heads of states and others, and we hope to be helpful, as I try to explain, to the multilateral system in general, to defending it and rejuvenating it, to try to get a slightly better governance for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine, for your very great introduction as well. I think Paris Peace Forum is really a new invention to really also support the multilateralism, but through multiple players, as you said, that civil society, NGO, business, think tanks, and all those more players to support multilateralism, rather than just in the past we have only big players. Now you have also the small, medium players into the global multilateral system, which is a great invention. I think this is really a great contribution Paris Peace Forum is making. Thank you very much. Now I would like to continue our key panel discussion, which is fascinating to hear all those great ideas from all those great organizations and thinkers. The next, I would like to invite Dr. Yakunin, who is also one of the co-organizers of this webinar. And Dr. Yakunin is the co-founder and the supervisory board chairman, Dialogue of a Civilization Research Institute based in Berlin. And Dr. Yakunin is a Russian business leader and a philanthropist, former president of Russian Railway. About 10 years he served in that position. And he's the head of Department of the State Governance of the Faculty of the Political Science and of the Moscow State University. And of course, he has also a lot of international experience, has also worked in the United States and many other countries. So we heard some of the opening remarks from Dr. Yakunin, but on this particular topic of multilateralism, challenges and prospects and innovations, we'd like to hear it from you again. Dr. Yakunin, please.
Okay, Henry, thank you very much. I suppose everyone will agree with me that we have fascinating discussion of the prominent people, and we are, exchanging very important ideas. Talking about multilateralism, it is inevitable we are talking also about about globalism. And as I stated previously, I'm optimist, but do you know who is pessimist? This is a well-informed optimist. So from this point of view, I suppose I will add a little bit of skepticism, in our discussion. Which way? In the few last years, all of us, we were experiencing and observing that more and more countries declared their interests first. We were observing the rise of nationalism. And from this point of view, I suppose Brexit is one of the most prominent examples, of this latest development in the world. Though, I am absolutely agree with those who are saying that globalism will continue. I think that the way we consider globalism will change. The previous model is not sustainable. And here, with your permission, I would like to disagree with one of our keynote speakers who stated that the crisis we are coming through is not systemic crisis. In 2005, at the World Public Forum, we stated inevitability of global economic crisis. Then nobody trusted us, but it occurred this way. Nowadays, when we are talking about the achievements through the latest, 70 years, it is completely correct. This is right. But these balances are still very, very severe. And it was absolutely correctly stated here, this balance is in international level, on international level, and this balance is in different countries. Inequality, this is the major challenge which we observe now. You know, even inside European Union, there are trends challenging this unity. For example, of course, we all heard the Italian Prime Minister saying that the current crisis has called into question the future sustainability of the EU. And that is a very strong statement. I think globalization is inevitable and objective process based on the development of science and technology and new way of trading. This is absolutely correct. But you know, some specific items of this system will be changing. I suppose the supply chains will become shorter, and you know, we already observed negotiations between well, not negotiations, but connections between Turkey and the United States of America exactly to this end. You know, my position, I always considered Road and Belt as a, you know, very good example of new globalization involving a lot of countries on the equal basis. Nowadays, it is challenging also. And speaking about the influence of coronavirus pandemic, it is also essential to say that it somehow enlightened the accumulated problems in existing model, in existing system. So from our point of view, when we are talking about the future, we need to address the question of the sustainability of the previous or existing economic model and the political structures above this economic model. And that is, you know, maybe the questions for further conferences. Now we are using multilateralism. Every speaker was using this term. It is correct, because we came from two polar world through one polar world, and then it was the notion of multipolar world. And I remember 3 years ago in the office of DOC Research Institute, we were thinking about the new title of, you know, Rhodes Forum. And then we decided not to use multipolarity, but rather to use multilateralism. You know, when we announced this title, just a week after, you know, in a very reputable German newspaper, the journalist challenged that the term multilateralism in its essence is anti-American. Can you imagine? Now, you know, we are, you know, talking multilateralism, understanding the diversity of the world and the richness of this diversity. So next thing I would like to point out, in the new globalization, what we are lacking now, this is obvious, it was discussed many times, we are lacking global leadership. Not leadership based on the assumption, my country first. Not leadership based on the superiority or feeling of superiority, but new leadership able to see the new path to the new frontiers, new aims of globalization. Ability to see the global picture, ability to, you know, to unite people in the face of global threats. And here I would like to refer to the opinion of very valuable, I like this author very much. You know, this is Jared Diamond. He is American biologist, and he wrote in his recent book a very important opinion. He said that the people of the world were able to unite in front of the major dangers, challenges, like, for example, World War II against Nazism. And he further stated that COVID-19 could become that type of the killer who is killing everyone despite the level of the development of the country or economy or something like that. And that is the possibility to level the differences of the globalization or challenges of globalization and to introduce somewhat new approach to the cooperation, because it kills many in different countries all over the world. So far, such challenges like temperature rise, pollution, actually do not believe to be this kind of unitedly accepted danger. But coronavirus can be this leveler, can be this type to bring, countries, powers back to the table to negotiate the new, possibly new world order. And this is very essential for the future of multilateralism and for the future of globalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yakunin, and for your also deep thoughts on the multilateralism from one polar world, two polar world, one polar world, multipolar, now multilateralism. But actually, it is important. I think countries like U.S. and EU, China, Russian, and all those big players. You're right. We need a global leadership. I think really there's a lacking of a global leadership that particularly during the crisis, that's going to really get the world into big trouble. So I think it's great to reflect and rethink about multilateralism and where the leadership comes from. So thank you very much. And now I would like to also welcome our friend, also Dr. Zhu Ming, to be actually, last but not least, a very important panel speaker. He was a former Deputy Managing Director, International Monetary Fund, IMF, and currently he's also the President of National Research Institute of Finance at Tsinghua University. But I know that Dr. Zhu has actually, he had very sound training graduate from economics of Fudan University and get his doctorate degree at Johns Hopkins University. But most importantly, he also worked at the World Bank for over 6 years and went back to China. And then actually he served as the executive vice president of Bank of China and also the deputy governor of Bank of China, the People's Bank of China. And so he's very knowledgeable. I know he's been appearing. He's also on the Davos Agenda Council. So we are very fortunate to have Dr. Zhu join us. And he's also was the vice chairman of the Western Return Scholars Association, where we used to sit together. So thank you, Dr. Zhu. Your thoughts, please.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Wang, and for your very kind words of introduction, and also thank you and for your kind invitation. It is indeed a great honor for me to join this distinguished panelist and also to share some of my thought with all those very distinguished panels. Given we're a little bit of late already, so in my roughly 5 minutes time slots, I will focus on one thing. Because the topic for this session is about multinationalism at the crossroads. So it's really the challenge and opportunities. I think the most challenge for the multinationalism we're facing today is obviously combating the COVID-19 and the pandemics. But it's also provide a huge opportunity for us to move forward on the global public health system. So we will be able to fight this virus pandemic issues now, but also put ourselves in a better position in the future when those things come back once again. Now, before that, I would like to mention one thing. I think all our panelists, everyone experienced the 2008 financial crisis. After 12 years, when we look back, when we see what financial sector is getting better and resilient and healthy and stronger, I think everybody will agree with me, it's a banking sector. Actually, compared with 12 years ago, the global banking sector is in a much better position with more capital, high capital ratios, and the more liquidity in terms of share to assets and a better structure of liquidity, more long-term, more deposit and less short-term things. Why that? Because the crisis started from the banking sectors, and the banking sector was hurt and beat badly, and afterwards, the world put a lot of efforts on reform the new regulatory framework on banking sector, request more capitals, request better liquidity structures, and also we set up the GFISs, global systemic important financial institutes concepts that gives them a special sort of regulatory guidance. So the banking sector now is indeed is really getting better than 2008. So what will happen after this COVID-19 pandemic crisis? I think the public health sector should be and will be better, because we are not in a good position, and we should change the kind of situation for good. So I would like to just point 3-4 things I think the key issues for us to move forward, and also emphasize why we build a global public health system need a new multinationalism, need a global efforts. First, I think it's become ever clear, and we are in a sort of a half open, half closed system. Half open, that means we're reopen the economy. Half closed, we're still combating with virus, which is very difficult and challenging periods. Because we still have more than 8 million people infected, and the 400,000 people died because disease, and we have very high plateaus, and the virus move like a wave, from one area to another area, now moving into more emerging market, which is a structure shift. So in that particular situation, I think everyone need to build an agile, I call it TTTT system. The TTTT means testing, tracing, tracking, and treatment. Because we need to position ourselves. When things happen, the local authority can quickly respond to the rising of the virus, deal with the most effective way. I think that's become very important. As we experienced in Beijing, as you all heard, we had a small rising of virus cases, and in a farming market and around that. But with this TTT system, use the AR and the big data technology, we'll be able to quickly identify 300,000 people visited this farm market in the past 20 days, and then get them tested. Then we found roughly around 300 infected cases. So we'll be able to send them to the hospital. So we'll be able to cut the linkage between those individual cases to the community spreads out. So I think that's very important. I think that this type of things will happen, and in almost all the countries today, in many places, we observe in US, in Texas, in Florida, we observe this in Brazil, in Russia, in India. I think it's absolutely important to build a system at this day when we also facing the challenge of reopening the economy, which require global cooperation. Why that? Because we need to share the most common meaningful practice. We need to share the knowledge about the modern technology, which is also very important and part of this whole game. And we need the global working together to understand the standard, the norm, and the system, and how the system can govern us by the local authority and also linked with a global network. The second issue is, obviously this crisis tells us we are not in a good position in the public health system, because in terms of facilities, in terms of hospital, in terms of bed, in terms of particularly our fever clinic networks, we're not prepared for really this type of scale, the global crisis. So it's absolutely important to use this opportunity to rebuild the global public health system, from hospital to clinic to fever detective small network rebuilding, from nursing training, from medical equipment and the storage and a capacity increase. This also requires global cooperations, because we need the world work together and have the common norm and help to move the equipment, move the training things and around the place. The third, obviously, is very urgently needed, is on the research and the manufacturing on the special medicine to treat this COVID-19 and also on the vaccine. There are more than 100 teams working on the research on the vaccines with very different stages. And China have 5 teams in the second phase testings and type of processing already. But we really need to getting the world work together to speed up the process, to cutting the cost, particularly with private sector, with all the scientists, all the labs working together to speed up. Because so far, I don't think we'll be able to vaccines in, say, in the next 9 to 12 months, and in terms of manufacturing. But the whole world really cannot waiting for another 12 to 18 months. The third issue is also important. When the pandemics come, we all realize we don't have enough medical equipment in storage. And we also realize that the supply chain doesn't work, the trade flow doesn't work. So in that sense, I think it's absolutely important to getting the medical equipment supply chain back to work and to make sure we have a proper trade policy and framework for global medical equipment and materials. I'll give you a very simple example. The ventilator machine is really urgently needed. China only accounts 20% of global market shares, but everybody come to China ask for the machine. This machine have 15,000 parts, involving 114 companies in manufacturing across 14 countries. So if you want to expand the capacity, you need those 14 countries from China, South Korea to Swiss to US, and all sit down, and all those 114 companies sit down to talk. Otherwise, we will not be able to increase the capacity. I think it's also important for the medical supplies and medical equipment. We need to have a free trade policy when those products across the board should trade with zero tariff, with a fast and a speed express and pass, with a very simple, easy customer process to make sure the medical equipment were moving across the board easily and effectively, which obviously need a global cooperation and need a multinational efforts. The fifth issue is, I think the most concern today is we are concerned the pandemic will gradually move to low-income countries, particularly in Africa. And Africa had the weak public health systems and the weak economic foundations. And we observed the economic growth is slowing down dramatically. We observed fragility in financial system as well already. So I think it's important at this moment, the world should work together to support the low-income country from medical equipment, from rebuilding system to combat this COVID-19, and also helps them to restore the economic activities and restore the financial stability as well, which obviously need a global cooperation, need a multinational efforts. So all those things is I listed 5 things I call the rebuild the future public health system, need a multinational efforts and need a multinational corporations, which is very urgently needed today, and which is absolutely important for the future. Which also involving some institutes like IMF and the World Bank reform, because they need more resource to prepare for the crisis. And they, for example, IMF proposed a 500 billion SDR and issuing new, but was not successfully passed. So I think those things also should be part of the global efforts as well. China has been publicly announced will welcome all the global corporations, in particularly in those areas, to share the practical knowledges, to support with the equipment and the medical materials. And China also announced when vaccines be invented and made it, and China will make it become the global public goods. China also supported with more than 100 countries with different medical equipment and committed billions to WHO. But we need more. We need all the countries working together. I think the UN should play key and a very important role in this area, because after this crisis, I do believe crisis will pass. We need a better global public health system. We need to take action now. We need multinational cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Min, for your also great sharing, and particularly on the multilateralism in fighting COVID-19. And you mentioned about 4T, which is also, I think, how we can collaborate, and using the ventilator as a good example. Without global cooperation, we cannot fight this successfully. So the virus knows no border, and then there's no country is a single island. So I totally agree that multilateralism, we have to be greatly strengthened. So we're a bit behind schedule, but I think we're correspondingly behind a bit. But now I would like to invite one discussant actually at this panel. We're also very fortunate to invite Dr. Wang Hongjiang. He's the counselor, Department of International Organization and Conferences, Minister of Foreign Affairs of People's Republic of China. So I would like to have Mr. Huang to share a few of his thoughts. Please, Councillor Huang, please.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yes.
Oh, I'm so excited, that it's a great honor for me to join you this afternoon. And especially that it's really a learning experience for me this afternoon, as we are together with eminent speakers, including Ambassador Xia, Prime Minister Rossini, and many others. I would say that this event is really a meaningful and well-organized one, which against the backdrop of the pandemic COVID-19, which is ravaging the havoc across the globe. There are many questions remain here after hearing the speakers, that whether the current global governance system is still effective, and how the UN system can deliver its commitments, which is enshrined in the UN Charter. We know that in 3 days that the UN will commemorate the 70th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter, which was the beacon of humanity, sharing the hope that all member states will enjoy a peaceful and prosperous world after the devastating Second World War. We have witnessed in the last 75 years that the great achievements the UN has made, including maintenance of the peace, security, and the rendering of humanitarian assistance to many countries, and also the protecting and promoting of human rights, which are the 3 pillars as mentioned by Ambassador Xia at the beginning. We, at the current stage, we can say that the UN Charter is still relevant now as it was signed 75 years ago. However, we are also witnessing increasing complex challenges and threats, as mentioned by previous speakers, including the protracted conflicts and the threat of terrorism, climate change, food security. Surely the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that we are facing now. Your Excellency, that I think that it would be remiss for me if I didn't take this opportunity to say a few words about China's involvement with the UN. As we see that China is a key participant in the work of UN, not only because China is one of the P5 and also the 2nd largest economy in the world. We are also since last year, China is the 2nd largest contribution for the regular and peacekeeping operation budgets. Also, China is the largest peacekeeping contributor among the P5. We have engaged actively with the UN family and member states to ensure that peace and stability are maintained, that the conflicts are mediated, that the climate change can be pushed forward with successfully that the signing of Paris Agreement. China is a key player in this regard. The last 75 years, as I said just now, has been of particular significance to mankind because with the signing of the UN Charter. But also, it is of concern for member states that we are seeing new trends in recent years, as has been put by previous speakers, that the rising of isolationism and also unilateralism, which has hampered the consensus among the UN family. As we commemorate the signing of the UN Charter, I think we also need to have a close look at what impact the COVID-19 will have on global governance. Not only the losses of economy and social and lives, but also the effectiveness of the UN system. I would also take this opportunity to try to sum up the key words that the eminent speakers have repeatedly mentioned. And I think these three words are very important. I will put it in 3 C's. The first C represents commitment. Our forefathers of the UN have wisely put it in the UN Charter that the 3 pillars should be maintained. And it is the political commitment of all member states that we work together, that we join hands to tackle the challenges of the current world. Without that, it will be difficult for member states to reach consensus. I try to take this opportunity to share two examples. One is that the reform of the WTO. Ambassador Yi said it very clearly that because of certain members deliberately block the negotiation, which has made the important organization imperialized. And the second example would be that not long ago, the UN Security Council is negotiating on a draft resolution, which would be in line with the call by UN Secretary General, calling for global ceasefire. But again, certain member was trying to block, and which unfortunately, the resolution was not invited yet. The second C would be capacity building. We understand that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused huge losses to all member states, and it is still spreading to many countries and regions. It is important, just like Dr. Zhu just now mentioned about the research and development of vaccine. This is one area of the capacity of the international community that we can address this egregious challenge. So it is important for the third C, the third C, that is cooperation and coordination. The planet Earth is our only home. It is the obligation of all member states of the UN that we put up with our strength, we unite with our strength to meet the needs of all member states. So briefly, I am very happy to share that the three C's would be, I hope that in the next chapter of our history, we are at the crossroad, it's important crossroad of history actually. And I believe with these three C's, the member states would uphold the banner of peace, security, and win-win solution. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Huang, and very good. You have summarized very well. I mean, three C's: commitment, capacity building, and of course the cooperation. So that's exactly I think we need to uphold in fighting the COVID-19 and also in fighting unilateralism. So I think we're going to conclude this panel now, but I think we have a fascinating discussion. We have well documented, we record, we digest. I think we had a representative from the World Bank, we have a representative from WTO, we have a representative from also IMF, we have a representative from OECD and even from previous panel. So we're going to have a more international representative to speak in our next panel. And also I'd like to introduce our second panel host, which is John Christopher Barr, and he's the Chief Executive Officer, Dialogue of Civilization Research Institute based in Berlin. And Mr. John Christopher also is the actually previously served as the head of strategy and development at the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations and the head of a policy dialogue at the World Bank. So he's a multilateralist guy, and he's really experienced, and he's now very active with DOC. So also I want to thank him for co-hosting this webinar and for his great contribution. I now want to pass my chair now to Mr. JC. Your turn, please.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Thank you, Henry, for your kind word of introduction. I'm very pleased actually to take on, after this initial or first roundtable that was in a way extremely rich with multiple perspective. And I see that in a way we are running way beyond time. So my task will be very difficult, and I'm afraid will be limited to have the nasty role of being a timekeeper. But I'd like very briefly to introduce this second roundtable that will be in a way, focusing on the SDGs and, in a way, the comprehensive framework for action. I think we have been discussing during these past hours on, let's say, the prospects for multilateralism, the policy orientation, but in a way, what is positive and reassuring is to see that there is actually, despite all the troubles, despite all the difficulties, there is a concrete roadmap. The SDGs have been adopted in 2015, and they provided a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for the people and the planet. And they have provided those 17 goals that, in a way, are extremely interesting because they give the evidence that the fight against poverty is not just a goal in itself. It is, directly correlated to promoting better health, but also education, but also fighting inequality, but also promoting gender equality and so on and so forth. So it is really providing a comprehensive roadmap in order to diminish significantly human poverty by the 2030. So in a way, in just 10 years' time. So we will be in this second roundtable focusing or zooming on what are actually those concrete achievements that are done in the field in this different sector. And we are very pleased in a way to have among the panelists some of the key players, the doers, not those who in a way talk about the future, but those who are doing the concrete action. So, and which are in a way most of the UN specialized agencies. And I think it will be very interesting to hear from them their own perspective on this concrete plan for action. So I immediately give the floor, and I will ask each panelist, to limit their initial remark to 6 minutes. Otherwise, I think the schedule will explode. And so I'm happy to give the floor first to Dr. Fyodor Lukyanov, who is the research director at the Valdai Club Foundation. Dr. Lukyanov, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, great honor to be present at this panel. In Russia, we have now today a holiday. This is a victory parade, which was postponed due to coronavirus. So I had the chance to listen to you and to watch a little bit of military equipment on television. And I think it's quite symbolic because this parade was dedicated to two events which actually created the contemporary international system. Unlike other participants in this panel, I'm not a doer, as our distinguished moderator said. I'm still a talker, so I try to be especially brief. And I would love to raise one issue which is connected to the discussion we had before, in particular to what Dr. Yakunin said in his intervention. What does it mean, multilateralism? Because we use this term, and this is the main notion of our discussion today. But it seems to me that many of us have a slightly different perception of what it is. Because multilateralism really is a very broad thing and broad notion. So I think to understand clearly what can be done in the future in this highly and extremely turbulent world environment, we need, first of all, to identify who are actors in this multilateral system. And secondly, again, referring to what Mr. Yakunin said, to what extent multilateralism and globalization are the same? From my point of view, they are not, because the time and a period in which we lived since say 1980s, 1990s, that was a period of significant rise of globalization in this contemporary liberal or maybe new liberal understanding. That was, in a way, a very successful period for many countries, China in particular, by the way. But the key idea during this period, conceptual idea, was that the role of state as a structural unit of international relations, will be not, maybe not undermined, but disappear gradually, because other forms of international governments will replace the traditional role of state. It's extremely interesting, the debate, we can argue about different aspects of that. But whatever we think about that period, I think now we have a completely different entourage. And the pandemic, which created the foundations for our discussion today, demonstrated one very important thing, that there is nothing but a nation state which in crisis situations can and should operate to protect citizens, and nothing can replace it in this role. It does not mean that pandemic will lead to fatal deterioration of international cooperation. Hopefully not. I hope it will be exactly the opposite. But the form of this cooperation certainly will be different than we imagined before, because we saw that all transnational structures, based on the idea that the competences of nation states gradually will move there up to those supranational institutions, they disappeared at the moment when people in different countries, citizens in different countries, started to feel that their life were endangered by, physically endangered by this calamity. And to a certain extent, what happened this year put everything in a different constellation. And this is maybe, it was inevitable, because the specificity of such a disaster as a pandemic is that you cannot do anything but to isolate, to combat this. So this is objectively only way to try to confront this problem. And now we live in an extremely interesting new phenomenon, when on the one hand, we understood how important it was to isolate ourselves from each other, just to give people safety and security they wanted. And it showed that the sustainability and strength and capacity of each concrete state was the key factor of how different countries could survive this pandemic. States, not international organization, not multilateral structures, states. At the same time, of course, that was a fantastic experience when the whole world was literally and completely unified, because we lived exactly same life everywhere, from Cape Town to Reykjavik, from Shanghai to, I don't know, Norilsk. It was exactly same problem. And the world demonstrated how interconnected it is. So I think that we are now facing a completely new challenge. How to pursue national interests, which are back. So no illusions about that. National interest, we can call it egoism, we can call it mercantilism. It might be sometimes very nasty, but it is back, and it will be the main characteristics of a period ahead of us. How to reconcile that with the necessity to cooperate in order to pursue those national interests, not the global wealth, not the common solutions per se, but to pursue national interests which cannot be addressed without very profound international cooperation, maybe in multilateral form, in some situations in bilateral form. I think bilateralism should be back as well. It's not a problem for multilateralism. It's one of elements of that. So I think conceptually, this is a completely different period, which is not, again, the paradox is it's not against globalization, but it requires to turn globalization into something completely different. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Lukyanov. We will have a second perspective now from another academic perspective before we go eventually to the doers. And I'm extremely pleased to give the floor to Professor Feng Zhongping, who is the Vice President and Research Professor of the China Institute for Contemporary International Relation. Professor Feng, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm most grateful to our host for inviting me to join this important discussions. As you introduced, I'm also expert. Talk a lot, but I'm expecting to hear more, concrete proposals, following discussions. I will use this 5 minutes, 6 minutes to make a number of points to share this with our colleagues. Following all the break of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been heated debate across the world on the the future of economic globalization. This afternoon or this morning, with many of our previous speakers has also expressed their views on this very important topic. It is quite natural because the focus is on the reshaping of a supply chain, industrial chain, etc. It's natural because these are something which has been hugely affected by the current crisis, pandemic crisis. We have been talking about, many of our panelists, we have been talking about what we could learn from this pandemic. I think one of the most important lessons, or perhaps if you agree, this is the most important lesson we should learn is from this pandemic is that we must do our best to avoid the climate disaster from taking place in the future. Not only globalization, which people think would not be the same after the pandemic. I think we must take the Sustainable Development Goals set up by the United Nations in 2015 much more seriously. If we take actions now, we still have good chances to achieve these goals. And the pandemic is a wake-up call, I think. So let me make a few suggestions on this. I have been working on Europe for many years. I think there is a good opportunity for China and the EU, the European Union, to work together in promoting the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals. China and Europe are two of the three biggest world economies. Both sides support multilateral corporations, believing that this is the only way to address the global challenges facing the world. So far, China and Europe has worked closely in fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic. And the recent video conferences between Chinese leaders and European leaders, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Macron, and the new leadership of the European Commission have indicated that the two sides are willing to continue to work on the post-pandemic economic recovery. At the moment, I think, China and Europe are focusing on trade and investment issues. But my argument is we should make the cooperation of climate issues as priority. Europe aims to become the first carbon neutral continent by 2050, and it's a great deal. So I think, the new commission call itself as the geopolitical commission. I think, Europeans should be proud to be the model for this great development. So I think China, Europe should build up a partnership for sustainable development. This is the one suggestion. Secondly, I think China's B&I initiative, Belt and Road Initiative, could also provide opportunities for China and Europe to achieve the sustainable development goals. I think China-European cooperation through Belt and Road Initiative could also promote sustainable development, not just in China and Europe, but also in other regions, including Africa, Central Asia, etc. So let me to sum up my points. The world badly needs powerful examples in jointly dealing with difficult problems like the pandemic, like the climate change issues, many other issues. When China and Europe work together, they are able to set examples for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Feng, for this very powerful comments and particularly, your key point to say that we should not waste this crisis and we should really learn from this crisis in a way to anticipate the possible next crisis about climate change. And in that respect also, I think suggesting, as you did, that maybe the time is also coming to build a new momentum for a new or revived cooperation between Europe and China. I think these are very important elements, as also mentioned before by Dr. Lukyanov, who in a way has really stressed this importance of the nation state. Evidently, the nation state is back as, let's say, a key priority, or the perspective of the national interest. And also his question about how to combine this new interest or new priority on the national interest and nation state, but also with the indispensable need for international cooperation. For now, it's like, there is an antagonistic perspective between the nation state and international cooperation. And evidently one of the key, let's say, challenges is really to see how we can combine harmoniously those two dimensions. So now we will now switch to our colleagues, who are heading different UN agencies in China, and who will tell us about indeed this SDG agenda, SDG plan implementation. And I'm the pleasure to give the floor immediately to Claire Courteil-Mulder, who is the country director or director of country office for China and Mongolia for the ILO, International Labour Organization. Claire, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you very much. I'd like to thank in particular Dr. Wang of the Center for China and Globalization. It is a real pleasure to be part of this important discussion. And, as the COVID pandemic might well be a test for the multilateral system, I think today's discussion is very timely and indeed relevant. So thanks again for inviting the ILO to take part in it. In the interest of time, I think I will jump directly to the key points I wanted to share with you today. At the ILO, and the ILO is a tripartite organization governed not only by government, but also by workers and employers representative of 187 countries. Our feeling is that the challenges faced by multilateralism are somehow linked to the downsides of globalization. While globalization has brought about many positive outcomes on issues such as poverty reduction, job creation, access to health, access to education, it is also associated with global challenges such as climate change and the widening of inequalities both within and between countries. And this leads to feelings of exclusion, of being left behind in many parts of the world. So this is why at the ILO, we work very closely with our constituents, government representative, workers' organization, employers' organization, to encourage and promote a human-centered approach to the world of work through dialogue. And in our case, social dialogue is really the DNA of the ILO. The ILO wants to bring multilateralism closer to the people, putting people first, involving people in the decisions that affect them, focus on the most vulnerable, and this is all fully in line with the spirit of the UN Charter, and of course also in line with the 2030 Development Agenda and the SDGs. So focusing on the 2030 Agenda, which is the topic of this panel, I think really this agenda brings a note of optimism to the future of multilateralism. I was actually wondering, Dr. Wang, if we couldn't read the title of this conference both ways, enhancing multilateralism to collectively achieve the SDGs, but it is also by collectively achieving the SDGs that we will strengthen multilateralism. In fact, the SDG provide a very concrete response to at least 3 fundamental questions about multilateralism. First, the legitimacy. The mere existence of the 2030 Development Agenda is a success in itself. It has been agreed by all countries and it is universally applicable. It represents a real consensus at the international level and many countries have included it in their national development plans. In that sense, it is a legitimate multilateral agenda. Secondly, the 2030 Agenda is action-oriented, formulated in the forms of goals to be achieved within a clear time frame. This responds to a certain extent to the criticism to multilateralism about the gap between the words and the actions. And finally, it is an inclusive agenda. It aims at involving all people, the normal people, in the action, and it has a strong focus on the most vulnerable and the ones who are left behind. And those are precisely the people who are usually most hardly hit by international crises, be they financial crisis, climate change, or indeed a pandemic. But of course, making the 2030 Agenda a full success story requires countries to deliver on the goals. Without results, there is no relevance. Clearly, the COVID pandemic will put a lot of stress on such delivery. While the progress towards the SDG were uneven before COVID, I think it is fair to say that now all the countries will face new challenges after COVID. And many institutions indeed at the national and international levels predict an increase in poverty, in hunger, and a decrease in access to health and education. Regarding SDG 8, which focus on the promotion of inclusive and sustainable economic growth and decent work for all, the prospects are not very optimistic. According to the latest ILO estimates, the current crisis has already reduced working hours by more than 300 million full-time equivalent jobs, affecting overwhelmingly those working in the informal economy. But if COVID-19 clearly puts pressure on achieving the SDGs, each country still has the option and choices to make to stay on track. As the ILO Director General said it, we can rebuild better more inclusive, and more sustainable. And this is where multilateralism can be useful. By providing both financial and technical resources to those countries that need it, by coordinating the national responses, the multilateral system can play an important role in the collective achievement of the SDGs. International cooperation and solidarity can make a difference. For that, we need a UN system that works in a coordinated way. We need policy coherence between the UN system on the one hand and the other actors of the multilateral system on the others, such as the WTO, the OECD, and the International Financial Institution. And last but not least, we also need a leadership at the national level which supports multilateralism and champions the SDG. And here, I think we will need to convince that multilateralism is not a threat to national sovereignty, but rather the way of solving today's key challenging and key problems, which are global and complex in nature. With that, let me conclude by saying that if we can collectively achieve the SDG, we will help rebuild the trust in the multilateral system. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Mrs. Courteil-Mulder, for making a very strong point about the need, in a way, to demonstrate results and to stress the importance of a multilateralism or globalization that works for all. And I think you rightly said that the notion of multilateralism or the philosophy has been very badly hit by the downside of globalization, because there was a very strong perception or feeling that globalization has been badly harming a very wide range of people and segment of the population, and that there is a need really to focus on concrete and measurable progress. I'm turning now to Douglas Noble, who is the representative to China of UNICEF, who will probably have very important also message to deliver. With many speakers, and starting with Prime Minister Raffarin, have stressed the importance of youth and the emerging generation, and the needs to give more voice to the rising generation. So Douglas Noble, you have the floor.
Thanks, Jean-Christophe. And I'm going to take us on a little bit of a slightly different angle, just to relate some of this particularly to COVID-19 and the Sustainable Development Goals and multilateralism, and just particularly to think a little bit about how some of this is affecting children and families. First, though, just a big thanks to the Center for China and Globalization for organizing this. It's been very interesting this afternoon. One of the things I think that we've certainly noticed, and I'm sure many others, is that COVID-19 has revealed inequalities that really threaten the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 is being felt hardest by the world's most marginalized and vulnerable. And with many people globally already living in poverty, the consequences of COVID-19 risks plunging them even further into hardship. Even before the COVID-19 crisis, we needed an additional $2.5 trillion a year of investment to close the financing gap for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, and about half of that requirement for Africa. So where we were already before we had this pandemic this year, we needed fresh, innovative ways of reducing inequality and addressing poverty, responding to the problems we already had with things like financing gaps to meet the SDGs. And now we have to address and respond to new problems like COVID-19 with a nuance to make sure that our interventions, which are going on for 6 months now and may have another year at least ahead of us, do not inadvertently make things worse. I'd like to give you 2 potential examples of that. First of all, I'd like to give you the example of school closures globally, which have been a major feature of countries' responses to COVID-19 and have left more than 1 billion school children in more than 130 countries out of school. Now, we can all understand the epidemiological and communicable disease control rationale behind those kind of interventions. There is, though, overwhelming evidence on the negative impact of school closures on children's physical and mental health, their nutrition, their safety, and their learning. Let me give you a few examples. School closures can increase children's exposure to physical, emotional, sexual violence. Children are more vulnerable to child labor if they're not in school. Millions of children, particularly in rural areas from poorer families and such like, rely on schools for meals, and this can lead to nutritional problems not being in school. And again, even prior to the pandemic, most low and middle income countries were facing a learning crisis. So prolonged school closures are likely to cause students to regress academically and cause significant learning deficits, especially given online learning is only temporary and doesn't necessarily benefit every child everywhere. So for all of these reasons, schools should be among the first public services to open when COVID-19 safety measures are put into place. And of course, we recognize the decisions of when to open schools. They must be made in the best interest of children. Adjustments need to be made when there's new information or outbreaks or risks change in local transmission and other conditions. But they should be the first services to open when it's safe to do so. Secondly, evidence is also showing the negative effects of COVID-19 on maternal and child health more broadly, and we already had problems in this area. So for example, a recent Lancet Global Health publication predicts that around 6,000 children could die every day from preventable causes over the next 6 months or so as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to weaken health systems and disrupt routine services. Now, this increase is avoidable if, in partnership, we work across sectors to prevent transmission of COVID-19, treat those who fall sick, but also address these unwanted effects of the type of responses that we have been aiming at to contain the spread. So, for example, prioritizing maintaining routine health services for all children and mothers, as well as ensuring COVID-19 prevention. That may mean separation of cold and hot hospitals and such like measures. To make sure that immunization, antenatal care, other routine services continue safely and avoid further health problems that will ultimately challenge SDG attainment. And obviously we need to do that whilst curtailing public fear about accessing health services by creating those safe and patient-safe environments for routine and emergency healthcare. So with those two examples, finally, let me say that I don't think that South-South cooperation, multilateral engagement, partnership has ever been more important than it is now for the SDGs. It was already very important, and then we hit the pandemic. Our response here in China as UNICEF has been to bring in essential supplies during the epidemic here, first in China in January, and then working on a back-to-school campaign with the Ministry of Education and China CDC to get that public service opened as soon as possible and as soon as it's safe to do so. We've been sharing lessons with many other countries as we go along, and I think that's an incredibly important thing that we can advocate for together. On China side, we've continued to grow our partnership with the Ministry of Commerce and the China International Development Cooperation Agency to deliver results for families under the whole framework of South-South cooperation. And already in the last few years, we've seen China contributing hugely to maternal, newborn, child health, early childhood development, humanitarian projects across a whole range of UN agencies working as a trilateral partner, all to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So let me just finish just by saying that something I was saying to my family recently, there'll come a day when you and your family will go to a health center to receive a vaccination for COVID-19. And you'll come outside afterwards and perhaps you'll say to each other, that's finally over, and breathe a sigh of relief. But until we get to that day, we need to focus our efforts together to address the old problems, to find solutions to new problems, and make sure our response to COVID-19 doesn't inadvertently exacerbate the situation for the most vulnerable and take us even further away from achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So thank you.
Thank you, Douglas, for this very strong call, and to say that in this time of crisis, multilateralism is even more needed than in any other time, and also to, in a way, alerting us, that the COVID crisis will probably badly affect the progress and the advancements of the SDGs, particularly in your sector. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Beate Tronkmann, who is the UNDP resident representative in China.
Thank you very much, Christoph, and a very good afternoon to everyone. First of all, thanks to CCG for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to participate in this very distinguished panel. And I wanted to take the time, the short time that I have for my remarks, to discuss with you a little bit the latest status of the SDGs. And similar to the argument that Douglas was making, why COVID-19 is making the SDGs actually more urgent, not less, and maybe also demonstrates some of the opportunities that we see in China in that regard. Now, in 2019, when the UN announced the Decade for Action for the SDGs, the Asia-Pacific region as a whole was not on track to meet any of the 17 SDGs without drastically accelerated action. And that was before COVID-19 shook the world. And I agree with Professor Fang that this pandemic is a wake-up call, in particular because it has laid bare some of the vulnerabilities and inequalities that are being created, have been created by our current growth models. And in many cases, through COVID-19, are actually now being protracted and deepened. Due to COVID-19 and this triple blow that we're seeing to income, education, and health, UNDP's latest estimates for human development show that human development for the first time in 30 years in 2020 will actually be regressing. And that's, of course, very concerning. But COVID-19, I think, is also an opportunity for transformation. And as countries begin to recover or look at their plans for recovery, I think there is a chance to change the trajectory of human development for the better. Now, to build back better, there is a whole gamut of areas, and we have discussed a lot of those already this afternoon and in the previous panels, a lot of areas that must be simultaneously addressed, from ensuring, for example, that social protection systems are inclusive and include everyone and the informal sector, from ensuring inclusive digitization for the future of work, but also in channeling private and public finance towards the SDGs. Now, I wanted to zoom in on one area, and here's another sort of convergence with the remarks of Professor Fang, and highlight the need to advance a low carbon transition to avert, in fact, another crisis that is looming, and that would make COVID-19 look pale in comparison. And I'm, of course, talking about climate change and the fact that climate change is becoming an ever increasing existential threat to humanity. It can unleash, we've seen this, ancient diseases trapped in the ice by the melting of the permafrost. We've seen anthrax returning, for example, in Siberia because of that. By 2030, we could have over 220 million people that could enter climate-induced poverty. So that's why I think we must shift to a low carbon economy now. And the world has in fact already proven that this new normal is possible during the immediate response to COVID-19. we have adopted many changes like working from home or taking these type of Zoom conferences that are already reducing our footprints. But I think beyond changing practices, we must accelerate sustainable policies and investments. Now, investing in green makes economic sense. Greening energy systems could globally add 98 trillion to global GDP by 2050, with healthcare savings 8 times the cost of investments because of cleaner air. It could also quadruple renewable energy jobs to 42 million in the next 30 years. So let me now turn to China a little bit. In China, new jobs in renewables already outnumber those created in oil and gas. Last year, China invested more than 80 billion in green energy and remains the dominant renewable energy investment market. It has been so since 2013. However, of course, as all countries, more can be done. China, because of the size of its economy, still accounts for around 20% of global emissions. China's 14th five-year plan is set to focus on clean energy and cutting carbon emissions. And that can be a powerful vehicle to galvanize greener investments by promoting sound investment standards, moving away from carbon-intensive infrastructure, and by boosting sustainable investments. The new normal is also cheaper. If China uses the most cost-effective renewable energy resources, it could generate more than 60% of its electricity from non-fossil fuel-based sources at 10% less of the costs of today. Now, globally, and here's the link to multilateralism, China can also support sustainable development globally and is actually becoming an increasingly important player in the global arena, including by further mobilizing capital flows for green projects, upgrading infrastructure, improving connectivity, and strengthening value chains to support the green economy at home and abroad. And of course, the BRI is an important vehicle there. I think the cooperation with UNDP and partner countries in these areas show China's readiness and willingness to share its experiences and resources in order to do so. So to conclude, let me just say, I think to me, COVID-19 is a formidable challenge, but it also presents an invaluable opportunity to push for a more inclusive and sustainable future in the spirit of the SDGs, and a planet that can support everyone and where all people benefit from development. And this will importantly also strengthen the resilience to future shocks. So in the post-COVID-19 world, I think the call on us, on the international community, is to make sure that sustainability is being shifted from being a side effect of temporary practices to a clear objective in and of itself. And that must be at the center of our recovery, because really there is no more time to lose to achieve the SDGs, to protect human development, and to safeguard life on Earth. So thank you very much for that opportunity, and very good to be with you all this afternoon.
Thanks a lot, Beate, for this very powerful and strong call, to, in a way, to mainstream sustainability in the international and also in the domestic agenda, and also, in a way, also to, again, to alert us on all the risks that are looming ahead. I think that, of course, the reaction is to say that nobody will be able to say we didn't know. I think, you are contributing as a UN agency, as many others, to try to get attention and to alert on those risks. I think the trick, and maybe this is something that could be a topic for another, let's say, webinar, is how to move from the we must, we need, and we should to the how can we reach this goal. You know, evidently there is a growing gap between those who are in a way aware and informed and those who in a way are not fully aware of this risk and or in a way are in a denial. And I think this is really one of the key tricks and objective is really how to fill this gap in order to be able to promote, you know, the good and the right policy that are needed. Before we turn to the next and the final panelist, I would like to take the chance, you know, to have Beate with us. We have, of course, lots of questions from journalists who are attending this webinar. I know we are way beyond time, but I was given the permission by the organizers, by CCG, to take one or two questions from journalists. I think there is one that is actually specifically for you, Beate, which is the following: is China attaches great importance to helping developing countries such as African countries in the fight against the pandemic. How do you think China's South-South cooperation contributes in the global fight against the pandemic and in promoting multilateralism and global cooperation? If you can just provide a quick response, and then we will turn to Dr. Yu Yongquan.
Yes, thank you very much, and that's a very relevant question. There's two things I would say. First of all, China has already and is indeed contributing globally to support countries in the global south in their response to the pandemic. And as UNDP, but also as other UN agencies, UNICEF, UNFPA, we have been working with China on this, ranging from procuring urgently needed protective personal equipment, PPEs, and medical equipment from the Chinese market as one of the few markets a few months ago that was actually open for exports of these type of equipments, to also sort of strengthening capacities and working on issues like addressing health waste and how to handle health waste. I think generally that China has a lot to share, and there's many platforms that it could use, including the South-South collaboration platforms, including the South-South Cooperation Assistance Fund, including BRI. Also in terms of the practices, some of the mitigation practices, ranging from digital models, going sort of online to solve some of the issues of making sure that we sort of all socially distance. So I think a lot that there is to share, and the UN system and UNDP certainly stands ready to serve as a conduit for these type of exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you, Beate. I have now the pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Yu Yongquan, who is the president of the Academy of Contemporary China and the World Studies.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished guests, dear friends, as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter, we are very delighted to co-organize this forum together with prestigious institutions from China and abroad. The speeches made just now are really inspiring, thought-provoking, and informative. We have had a candid and a constructive dialogue on issues related to the UN Charter and the Sustainable Development Goals, and have reached broad consensus From the perspective of the organizers, this forum is very productive and fruitful. Thank you very much for your participation and contribution. All of us have highly recognized the vast importance of the international order and the norms established by the UN Charter. They have been crucial in maintaining peace, stability, development, and prosperity in the world after World War II, and should be valued and carried forward. All of us realize that in a world full of risks and uncertainty, we live on the same planet. We must look forward and hold the vision of a community with a shared future for mankind. We work to realize the sustainable development goals. Only by doing this can the human society have a bright future. In the long journey of sustainable development of mankind, the UN Charter, the UN, and other international organizations play a very important role by providing guidance, leadership, and coordination. We are living in the same world and faced with a common health crisis. In the context of the pandemic, sustainable development would be impossible without human health. And the WHO, as a specialized agency of the UN, plays a key role in safeguarding human health. As WHO Director General Dr. Tedros said, "Healthy is not a luxury item. It is a foundation of social and economic development. Health is a human right for all people, not a privilege for those who can afford it." Therefore, the theme of our forum today, enhance multilateralism to collectively achieve the sustainable development goals, is very relevant. Building a global community of health for all is a vision and a major initiative for international cooperation put forward by President Xi Jinping. China has made much efforts to help other countries tackle the epidemic, so that together we can build a global community of health for all. As of last month, China had provided anti-epidemic assistance to 150 countries and 4 international organizations, and provided $50 million in cash assistance to WHO. In addition, China has pledged to provide $2 billion in international assistance within 2 years to support the fight against the epidemic, as well as to help restart the economic and the social development of affected countries, especially developing countries. China will also work with the UN to set up a global humanitarian response depot and a hub in China. These messages have been very well received by the international community. In the global fight against the epidemic, the voice of cooperation has not been drowned out by the noise, and the people across the globe are still more ready to join hands than let go. The UN and the WHO have played an important role in leading and coordinating the effort to fight the epidemic. And the countries as a whole have been able to look out for each other. In the progress of international cooperation, we have got a better sense of a global community for health for all. And the cooperation between different countries has offered much positive energy for building such a global community. Since the outbreak of the epidemic, our academy has worked with international partners in organizing more than 10 bilateral and multilateral think tank forums, and publishing some special reports, such as China Fight Against COVID-19 and the Future of a Global Public Health Governance. We also launched a multilingual ebook about the fight against COVID-19. In the face of major issues such as upholding multilateralism, building a global community of health for all, and achieving sustainable development goals, we lead an unhold openness and inclusiveness, advance cooperation for mutual benefit. We lead to support UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' new round of efforts to reform the UN system. We lead to seize shared opportunity for common development by major initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative. Consideration could be given to further suggesting international cooperation through global and regional public health governance organizations. Encourage the establishment of a highly efficient coordination mechanism for decision-making and implementation among different countries, and improving global governance with a focus on the needs of poor and vulnerable people so that they can better share the fruits of global development. We look forward to working with you all for joint research programs and events so as to make due contribution to the building of a global community of health for all and to the realization of the sustainable development goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yu, for this overview and also stressing, you know, the important role that China has been doing in supporting, you know, many countries and organizations, and particularly UN organization, in this context of the crisis, but also for stressing this importance of this shared future, or community for shared future. And indeed, this is something that in a way has already been mentioned by a few speakers. For the first time ever, in a way, in the history of humanity, all humankind has been confronted to the same threats. This is something that has never happened before. And in a way, as we said before, we should not waste a crisis, and we should, take this opportunity or this time of a common threat from all parts of humanity, eventually to start developing this sense of a common belonging, a sense of shared responsibility. And I think this is something that eventually could be discussed further on, but again, we are way beyond time. I would like, if you allow me, to ask our representative from UN agencies that are still with us to respond to one other question from the journalist. I know it is quite tricky, but if you could respond very, very briefly. The question is how to evaluate the role and the effectiveness of multilateralism and also the UN system in the global fight against the COVID-19 epidemic, and what challenges and enlightenment does the COVID bring to multilateralism and to the UN system. I know that we could call another 3 or 4 hours a session for that, but if you could give us, from a UN perspective, you who are on the front line, how you see the role and the effectiveness of the multilateral system and the UN in responding to the crisis. So maybe I could ask first Claire Courtel-Mulder, and then Beate Trenkmann, because I think that unfortunately Douglas Noble had to leave us. So maybe Claire, if you want to give your views on that question.
Yeah, it is indeed a difficult question, but a very important one. I think it's a bit it's a bit early to evaluate, what has been the results of the UN action, because we're still in the middle of this crisis. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, in Latin America at this very moment is under lockdown. They're really at the beginning of the crisis, what we went through in Asia a few months ago. So the crisis is not over. It's a bit early, but I would say from an ILO perspective, at least, I think the test really would be, how do we recover from this crisis? Do we really recover, stronger, building more resilience, in a more inclusive way, in a more sustainable way? If the countries, if there is progress in the recovery on those points, I think that would be my very personal way of assessing the work of the UN. But again, I mean, it's my personal view. It's the ILO's view, and I'm sure the WHO, for example, would have a different view. Thank you.
Thank you, Beate.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, obviously it's a global problem. It needs a global response, and I think the UN is the only truly fully inclusive multilateral platform that the world has. And I think in the UN we have heeded the call, because we have in the UN actually mobilized the machinery to address different streams of the response. So you have WHO leading on the health response and health governance. You have humanitarian, on the humanitarian side, with OCHA leading the humanitarian appeal on COVID-19 for the emergency response. And there is a $2 billion appeal that has been put out. And you have the UN Secretary General, who put out the UN socio-economic framework for recovery from COVID-19, asking UNDP to be the technical lead to fast forward into the future and indeed ensure that we can build forward and build back better to ensure that we are reaching the SDGs. And all of us on the ground have been asked to review our programs from that perspective, to make sure that we put resources, repurpose resources behind that overall objective. But there's also new funding platforms with the multi-partner trust fund office in New York that has put out a platform for the socioeconomic recovery. So I think very much this is a test for UN reform. And I think we're sort of hearing that loud and clearly as the UN system, and are gearing sort of into combining emergency with a development response. Thank you.
Thank you, Beate. And I'd like really now to express my gratitude and thanks to all the panelists in this second roundtable. I think it was a very not only interesting, but also very, in a way, inspiring discussion, and coming up with very concrete points and analysis. So we have been, in a way, I mean, discussing now for almost 2 hours and a half the future of multilateralism, and also the need to move forward on this particular occasion of the 75th anniversary. One of the speakers before mentioned that the 75th anniversary of the UN was made possible because it was also the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, and that the UN and the vision of a global scheme or global architecture for cooperation emerged from the chaos of the World War II. Let's also have in mind that in about 2 months' time, the world will commemorate the 75th anniversary of the bombing in Hiroshima, and which was also one of those key let's say, terrible circumstances that led or paved the way towards the creation of this international cooperation framework and the sort of an unanimous call from the leaders, but also from the population to overcome the differences, to overcome hatred, really to try to look at what we as humanity have in common. And evidently also stressed by a few speakers, this sense of leadership, this sense of responsibility, this sense of historical moment in time has been in a way fading away in the recent time. And the need, to have an enlightened leadership, that would give the way or give a sense of a direction is absolutely crucial at this point in time. And since we are now wrapping up, and I think what I think is really important is really to look at how to move from this sort of almost consensus that we had today, and but it's in a way talking among the converters, among those who know, among those who are aware. But evidently there are across the street a whole range of people being leaders, being influencers, being people who have a very different approach. And probably one of the greatest challenge is really to see how we can bridge the gap between those, who want to promote cooperation, who want to promote peace, who want to promote a sustainable future, and those who are either in denial or not informed or whatever. And in a way, these are two sort of tribes that are dismissing, ignoring, and fighting each other. And I think the time now is coming to look at how we can reconcile the vision of those sort of tribes that are really going increasingly in opposite direction, because this will never work. I mean, we need, in a way, to respect the difference. And as we said before, is really to say, how can we combine the legitimate aspiration from many people, who have a nation state and a sovereign framework that would protect them, but also how to make it compatible with a very assertive and a very effective international cooperation. This is really, I think, at the very heart of the real challenge for, well, only the 1 or 2 or 3 years to come, because this is, in a way, can be a turning point for humanity. And I think it is very important really to bring all those perspectives together. In that respect, and I'd like just to mention that DOC, the Dialogue of Civilization Institute, has been very pleased to partner, and we express a strong gratitude to Dr. Wang for partnering today. And the Dialogue of Civilization Institute has initiated in the last 2 or 3 months a major initiative setting up a high-level group with leaders and influencers from all parts of the spectrum, from different cultures that in a way represent humanity and a different perspective, with the goal to come up with a set of recommendations on how to reinvent an international framework that would work for all. And I really stress this point, that would work for all, where everyone would feel that their legitimate aspiration, expectation, but also fear and threats will be taken into account. There is a strong sense in the overall impression that they are the winners and the losers, and those who have benefited from international cooperation or not. And we really have the conviction that it is important to bring everybody around the table in a way to work together, as it happened 75 years ago, where obviously the most antagonistic ideology didn't prevent the leaders to work together and in a way to transcend their differences, to work together for the good of humanity And in a way, we have seen in the past 75 years that the peace and prosperity has prevailed despite those profound differences. And I think this is the time, you know, in a way to revive this spirit for international cooperation. So sorry to take this few minutes, you know, but I think, you know, this is what I got from the discussion today. And now I'm hand over to Dr. Wang for the final words.
Okay, thank you, John Christopher, for your excellent summary. Actually, the second panel is also very good, excellent, and we had a lot of questions, but I'll be given the time, so we cannot go through this time. We'll have next time. Probably we'll pass the question to our speakers if they need it. And what I would like to say is that we actually had a very fascinating discussion this afternoon and also this morning, and it's really probably it's the first time that definitely the first time in China, but also first time internationally that we gathered so many people that before the signing of the UN Charter 75 years anniversary. We actually had 20 speakers and you know, distinguished panelists, and we have actually also we had assembled, actually invited so many international stakeholders to participate. Like we had a World Bank, we had the IMF, we have WTO, we have OECD, we have Paris Peace Forum, we have UNDP, we have ILO, we have UN in Geneva, and we have UN China, UNICEF, UNIDO, and ILO, and you name it. Also including Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs. So it's unprecedented that we have first time in China we gather so many multilateral forces, players, to stay together. Actually, John, it's not 2.5 hours, it's almost more than 3.5 hours. It's quite a comprehensive discussion. I think we'll give a very good summaries of that. We're going to digest, we're going to really deeply analyze that, and we try to seek out recommendations to the relevant international agencies and also governments as well. As a matter of fact, we had over 2,000 invited who scanned our code bar and actually lessons us online, according to our technical staff, that we have over 2,000 experts, media, and the representative people interested in this topic through the invitation, actually lessons us online. So finally, I really want to thank our you know, people that really put a lot of effort into this and also worked with us. So we actually want to thank very much the Academy of Contemporary China and World Studies, which is headed by Dr. Yu, who have actually greatly supported this event as well. We have also from China Center for International Security and Strategy, which is Madame Fu Yin's think tank attached with Tsinghua University. We have also Center for, we have also from Center for the Dialogue. Actually, we have international partners, that Dialogue of Civilization Research Institute, which is represented by Dr. Yakuning and John Christopher, greatly partner for organizing this event. And we also have a Balda discussion group. We have a British East Asian Council. So we have a, you know, it's a great collaboration among us to really put this together. I think we have a lot of things to digest, and we want to thank all those great participants. Also, particularly like we had invited the keynote of former French Prime Minister, Mr. Raffrin. Also, we have Ambassador Sa, who is the Undersecretary General of the UN. Also, so we had so many distinguished keynote. So this is really a great format, great discussion, and we have our think tank scholars and also staff is also make a good document of that. So we hope that this is really will contribute to the activities in celebrating 75th anniversary of the UN and also the UN Charter. So this is really a great. We have so much achievement and thinking and new recommendations, new thought, very comprehensive. So I want to thank all of you very much on behalf of Chinese organizers, and also that we welcome you to collaborate, as Dr. Yu has mentioned. So we hope that we'll work together in the future, and we know it's a bit late because we have such a rich and a very lively and constructive discussion. So we want to thank all of you very much, and we hope to see you again in our next event. So thank you very much, and appreciate all your time. Thank you very much. So we'll see you. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Dr. Wang.